Yeah.
Present that member needs to be able to hear, and we need to hear them, and then
Okay. Do I have to say it both times? Do it both meetings? Who cares about the first
who
phrase?
cares about it?
Okay. All set? Thank you, everybody. The Glencoe Zoning Board is also the Glencoe Zoning Commission. I'm sure that you're all here for the Glencoe Zoning Commission, but we first have to knock off the Glencoe Zoning Board meeting. It'll be fast, so please bear with us. Can we call to order the meeting of the Glencoe Zoning Board of Appeals?
Yes.
Roll call, please.
Howard Rowan.
Here.
Deborah Carlson.
Here.
Sarah L. Sasser.
Here.
David Friedman. Alex Kaplan.
Here.
John Satter.
Here.
Scott Novak.
Here.
The first item is to consider adoption of the September 9, 2019 Zoning Board of Appeals meeting minutes. They've been circulated, and we've had a chance to review them. Is there a motion to approve them?
Motion to approve?
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Motion. Thank you, Deborah. We have a rule that if a member can't be present, they can call in. They have to be able to be heard and also to hear. And one of our members, Deborah Carlson, is doing that now, and she's going to do the same thing at the next meeting. The next item on the zoning board agenda was a request for a variance at 348 West Elm Court, but that's been postponed till the next monthly regular meeting. And so we want to announce that if anyone is interested in that, wants to talk about that, come back in a month. Is there any public comment with respect to the zoning board of appeals? None heard. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion adjourned.
Is there a second? All in favor?
Aye.
The motion
Aye.
is adjourned. Thank you, Deborah. Okay, the next item, let's call to order the zoning commission meeting for tonight. Roll call, please.
Howard Rowan.
Here.
Deborah Carlson.
Here.
Sarah L. Sasser.
Here.
David Friedman. Alex Kaplan.
Here.
John Satter.
Here.
Scott Novak.
Here.
And, Chairman, just for formality's sake, because we are holding a public hearing tonight, with the member attending telephonically, the state rules, state law requires us to have a quorum physically present, which we do. And for the purposes of the fact we're doing the public hearing, if we could have just a motion and a vote to approve the telephonic attendance of Commissioner Carlson.
Is there a motion?
I make a motion to approve the teleconference.
Is there a second?
Second.
And that can be a voice vote.
All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Okay, the motion carries. Anyone have a public comment other than marijuana? So the next item on the agenda is a public hearing regarding amendments to the village's zoning code regarding the appropriate definitions, zoning districts, and regulations for cannabis business establishments in the village of Glencoe. And what we're going to do tonight is first we're going to have a presentation. We've all gotten materials that are public, analysis done by the staff, presented to the village board, which led the village board to refer this to us. Like I said, those have been made public. And what we're going to do tonight is hear a presentation from our staff concerning where we are. Then we'll have some questions from the board for the staff. Then we will invite anyone from the public who wants to speak to do so, there are some rules. The main rule is that you're limited to 3 minutes, because otherwise we would never get out of here. If you want to make a comment, you should be talking about what we're talking about, which is the regulations for cannabis in the village of Glencoe. If you are a representative for a group, you can have 6 minutes, providing the other members of your group agree to waive their time to talk. So if you want to come at us 3 minutes at a time, that's okay. Alternatively, if someone wants to make a more fulsome presentation, that's fine too, but you give up your individual right to your 3 minutes. We have some audio-visual equipment, but unless you've made arrangements to make a presentation ahead of time with that equipment, you're not going to be able to do so here. All of the questions and comments from the audience should be directed to us. You're not supposed to cross-examine anybody. This isn't that kind of a hearing. If you ask us a question, we may answer then, but we may not. And we would ask that everybody try to be as courteous as you can under the circumstances. With that, I would invite the village staff to make its presentation.
Thank you, Chairperson Roan and members of the Commission. Good evening. My name is Sharon Tanner. I'm the Assistant Village Manager here at the Village of Glencoe. This evening, we have a presentation regarding potential zoning regulations regarding cannabis business establishments, should they ultimately be allowed to operate within the Village of Glencoe. This evening, we'll review the referral and request for recommendation that was made by the Village Board to the Zoning Commission. Village Attorney Stuart Weiss will provide a brief overview of the Illinois Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act, which is the state law that will legalize the possession, use, and purchase of cannabis products by individuals who are 21 and older in the state of Illinois. We'll talk a bit about municipal regulation and zoning authority that's created under the state law, as well as state regulatory authority that's created by the law. We'll provide an overview of the Village Board's preliminary feedback following its initial discussions on the matter, and we'll provide a summary of potential zoning code amendments to aid in your discussion this evening, and ultimately in your development of a recommendation for the Village Board regarding zoning code regulations should cannabis businesses ultimately be allowed to operate within the village. And then we'll summarize the next steps in the village's ongoing discussions regarding the matter. And so I will turn it over to Mr. Weiss.
Thank you, Sharon.
Just to give members of the public a sense of what the purpose of tonight's hearing is and where we are in the process, that the Village Board of Glencoe has held a series of discussions at its Committee of the Whole meeting, where it was presented with a lot of the same information that the Zoning Commission will hear tonight about the Act and about what is within their jurisdiction for regulation. And they made then a referral, as Sharon said, to the Zoning Commission. So often when you have a zoning code amendment that comes in, it's a private party that's requesting that the zoning code be changed. In this case, the applicant is the village itself. It's the Village Board. And the Village Board has asked the Zoning Commission to determine if the decision will be made to allow cannabis businesses, in what way should they be regulated from a land use and zoning perspective. So tonight the decision will not be so much on the question of whether cannabis businesses should be allowed in Glencoe. The Village Board has indicated a preliminary openness to that. They've not made a final decision, but rather this body is tasked with determining if they are allowed, how they should be allowed, in what locations, and subject to what regulations. The public hearing will be conducted tonight, and you as members of the public are entitled to speak and give your opinion. And after that, the Zoning Commission will either tonight or possibly at a continued hearing, depending on how things go, deliberate and make a recommendation to the board. They will vote on that recommendation, and that recommendation then goes back to the Board of Trustees. The Board of Trustees is the only body that can actually change the zoning code. So what happens at this body is not a final decision, it is simply a recommendation. And then the record that is created at the public hearing, for those of you who have sent letters, for those of you who have submitted petitions, for those of you who will speak tonight, all of that will be transmitted up to the board to consider. And the board will take all that into account, plus the zoning commission's recommendations, and they will decide what to do from there.
Okay.
Did the board ever ask the public,
Excuse me, what was it?
did the village board ever ask the general public in Glencoe what their feelings were on this issue before they recommended?
So there's going to be a time for public comment. There'll be a time for public comment later that you'll be able to get up and speak and ask your questions.
Pretty easy question.
So everything that's discussed at the village board is published for notice ahead of time.
No, that published and being asked are two different things.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so just to give a very quick summary of the State Act, the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act, which was adopted at the end of the last legislative session, and then becomes effective on January 1st, 2020. What it will allow is the purchase, possession, and use of recreational cannabis by adults. That is something that is not before any local board. People over the age of 21, regardless of where they are in the state of Illinois, will be able to possess and use recreational cannabis, subject to certain limitations on where they can use it. But no village or city can opt out of allowing people to possess if they are over the age of 21. Consumption by adults on private property, and then there's going to be a state licensure of recreational cannabis dispensaries, cultivation centers, and related businesses. We'll describe some of the other businesses that might be developing. Municipal zoning regulations. This is that municipalities are authorized, are given a very wide latitude to determine how, if they want to allow this, how they would allow this in what districts, under what conditions, including hours of operation and other conditions that will be discussed by staff at a later time. There's also a number of levels of state, county, and municipal taxation of the product. Medical cannabis patients, people who are currently registered and may be registered in the future under the medical program, will be able to grow a certain amount of plants in their homes. And that's something that that municipalities have limited power to regulate. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's what's allowed. Here's what's prohibited under the Act. Consumption of cannabis in a public place, on school grounds, in close proximity to minors, or in any place where smoking is prohibited under the Smoke-Free Illinois Act. So this is actually more restrictive than what is required of alcohol, but it is kind of the same model that you're not allowed to consume in public. Sale of cannabis to minors under 21, possession or consumption by minors, except in certain limited circumstances for persons with under 21 who have medical patient cards. Home delivery is not going to be allowed. Incidentally, neither are drive-thrus. Possession of cannabis in a motor vehicle, unless the package is sealed, child-resistant, tamper-evident, and reasonably inaccessible. And then driving under the influence of cannabis, there's no change to the law. That's currently against the law, and that's not changing at this point. So what is left to municipalities to decide? They are allowed to prohibit or limit the operation of recreational cannabis businesses. They can pick the time, place, and manner and even number of these that can operate within their boundaries. They can pick and choose which types of the businesses, whether it be cultivation centers, craft growers, dispensaries, or the other kind of ancillary businesses we'll talk about tonight. You can require that a cannabis business obtain a special or conditional use permit rather than just be a permitted use. That requires an extra level of process coming before a board like this and making yourself subject to certain conditions that might be determined by the, or recommended by the commission. Separation/distance from other land uses. There are certain ones that are already included in the statute. For instance, no dispensary may be within 1,500 feet of another dispensary. The state law wanted to make it very clear that they did not want these clumping at four corners or in particular like green districts. And municipalities can impose stricter distance requirements, requiring these to be farther apart from each other or farther apart from certain sensitive uses. That'll be a significant part of the staff's presentation, showing what different distance requirements would result in. There's other municipal zoning authority, including appearance review, signage review, parking standards, and many of the other things that you can normally apply. So, okay. So all of these facilities are going to be licensed by the state of Illinois. Right now, the state of Illinois is the sole licensor of the 56 existing dispensaries and 20 to 21 cultivation centers that are operating in Illinois under the medical program. The state will be reserving that licensing authority to itself. So it's not going to be the same model that we have for liquor licenses. We will still be able to license businesses, or they'll be subject to the same business registration requirements that we have for any other retail business. But state licensing is, they pretty much preempted us in that case. And I think I've already hit the other points on this already. So Sharon's going to take back over now.
Great. Thank you. The village board has held initial discussions on the topic of cannabis business establishments going back to the early part of this year, beginning in March, when the state law was still in draft form. The village board received a presentation of the bill that ultimately, after some modification, became state law. In June, the village board passed what we called a red flag resolution, which essentially directed a process for zoning code amendments to be considered should the village ultimately allow cannabis businesses to operate within the village. And that leads us to our hearing this evening. As I believe Mr. Weiss mentioned a moment ago, the village board discussed the topic of cannabis business establishments generally at its August and September Committee of the Whole meetings this month. And this evening, we're commencing the public hearing before the Zoning Commission. Over the next several months, after the Zoning Commission concludes its discussion, it will make a recommendation to the village board regarding zoning regulations should cannabis businesses ultimately be allowed. And the village board will then make a policy decision as to whether to allow or prohibit cannabis businesses, and if they are ultimately allowed, under what zoning regulations. The act will become effective January 1st of 2020. That does not mean that the village must have concluded its discussion by then or have made a policy decision by that point, but that is when legal sales will begin within the state of Illinois in any dispensary that holds a license to do so. We expect that the village board's discussions related to taxation, if businesses are allowed, would continue some time into early next year. Next slide, please. The village board, after its discussions in August and September, developed some initial feedback for the Zoning Commission in its discussion this evening, and I'll summarize that in this presentation. First, the village board expressed preliminary interest in allowing cannabis businesses as special uses in the B2 and HF zoning districts. As Mr. Weiss had said at the onset, that is an openness to it at this point. It is not a final decision. The types of businesses that there may be an openness to are dispensaries, craft growers, infusers, and processors. There was not interest in cultivation centers, and there was not interest in allowing on-premise consumption of cannabis, whether in a cannabis business or any other type of business establishment in the village. Additional zoning regulations for the Zoning Commission's consideration and discussion this evening are separation or distance requirements from sensitive uses, maximum hours of operation or other regulations pertaining to hours of operation, signage and advertising requirements, off-street parking requirements, facility, security, lighting requirements, or other operational requirements. Next slide, please. As I had mentioned, the village board's initial feedback was regarding cannabis businesses as special uses. By way of background, there are permitted uses and there are special uses that are provided within the zoning code. Permitted uses are those that are allowed by right if that land use complies with all other aspects of the village code and the zoning code, and there is no additional level of review that's required from a zoning perspective. On the other hand, special uses are considered generally compatible with other uses, but they warrant some additional level of review due to potential impacts on neighboring properties, which may be things like noise, traffic, or other impacts on other land uses within the zoning district. Special uses are authorized when a special use permit is granted upon recommendation by the zoning commission and approval by the village board. Under the village code, the village may limit the number of special use permits that may be issued. Based on the village board's preliminary feedback, our recommendation is that the zoning commission consider a recommendation to require special use permits should cannabis businesses ultimately be allowed. And we would also recommend that the zoning commission discuss whether you will recommend to the village board limiting the number of special use permits. Next slide, please. On the next several slides, we'll go through a series of recommendations regarding potential zoning code amendments. And these are provided to you to aid in your discussion this evening. They are all provided in the context of if cannabis businesses are ultimately allowed, then this is how we recommend amending the zoning code in order to regulate them. So beginning with the definitions that would be in the zoning code, we would recommend creating a series of definitions which are laid out on the screen, defining each of the types of businesses that would be allowed if this is the recommendation, as well as a collective definition for cannabis business establishments, which is a term that you'll hear me use throughout the presentation. One point that I'll make specific to dispensaries is that if this is a recommendation, we would suggest that there be a single definition for dispensaries, whether they serve the medical cannabis market or the recreational cannabis market. Our anticipation is that they'll be regulated in a similar fashion by the state moving forward, and this would allow consistent regulation within the village. Next slide, please. Okay. Based on the initial discussions by the village board, we'll talk a bit about the B2 districts and the HF districts. Within the B2 district, we would suggest that the zoning commission consider a recommendation to, again, if cannabis businesses are ultimately allowed, allow them only by a special use permit. And we would suggest considering a recommendation for a minimum of 500 feet between a cannabis business and a sensitive use. A sensitive use, as we've defined it for your discussion this evening and for your consideration this evening, is consistent with the types of sensitive uses that are currently in the zoning code for medical cannabis dispensaries. Those are pre-existing public or private elementary schools or daycare centers, daycare homes, group daycare homes, or part-day childcare facilities. In the HF district, again, we would suggest considering requirement of a special use permit. However, in the HF district, we are not suggesting that you consider a distance or separation requirement, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But that recommendation is based on the geography of the HF district. There are some natural buffers that exist within that district that serve as a buffer to any other type of use, namely the Edens Expressway to the east, a large ComEd right-of-way to the west, and lack of access to parcels to the west. Next slide, please. Okay. On this slide, we have a bird's eye view of the village with all three of our commercial districts boxed out in black. The HF district is to the southeast. The B2 district is to the southwest. The B1 district is in the center portion of the map. On this map, we show distance from sensitive uses, again, those being the types of uses that I mentioned just a moment ago: schools, daycare centers, childcare facilities. The red ring is a 250-foot radius, the yellow ring is a 500-foot radius, the green is a 750-foot radius, and the blue ring is a 1,000-foot radius. And we'll drill down into the B2 and the HF districts on the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. Okay. Beginning with the B2 district. The B2 district is that sort of triangular shaped parcel that has a bold black line around it with B2 stamped in the middle. The two sensitive uses that are in proximity to that district are shown on the map, and to the extent that the Zoning Commission may recommend the B2 district, if you wish to require a distance requirement from sensitive uses that would allow the entire B2 district to be eligible for a cannabis business, we would suggest that you consider a 500-foot radius. However, if you considered a different radius, that would have a different impact as to the eligibility of that parcel to have a cannabis business on it. As you can see, there's a portion of the B2 district that's in that green 750-foot radius and a portion that's in that blue 1,000-foot radius. Next slide, please. Okay. And then the HF district is divided into two parcels. There's the parcel to the north and the one to the south, and again showing proximity to a sensitive use. And on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about some of those natural buffers that I mentioned just a moment ago. So here we have, again, those same two parcels, the HF district, which is spread between the parcel to the north, which is outlined in red with HF stamped in it, and the parcel to the south, that it also is outlined in red, stamped with HF. To the east, you have the gray bar running along the side, that is the Edens Expressway. Also east of that, the Skokie Lagoons. To the west of that, that yellow diagonal bar that's running just west of those properties is that ComEd right-of-way that I mentioned. The yellow, not quite triangular shape that's shaded in the middle is the Village Water Tower site that helps us orient us to the district and where it is within the community. There is some commercial property that is in the village of Northfield that is just to the north of that, again with commercial uses such as an animal care facility, an animal boarding facility, and some others. Next slide, please. Okay. As we mentioned earlier, the village has the authority to regulate hours of operation for cannabis businesses beyond the maximum hours of 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. that are set forth in state law. So what that means is that the Zoning Commission could recommend a limitation on the number of hours, a maximum number of hours, or a set window of time. The village code does not have any sort of provision about hours of operation in our general business license regulation. And when I say our general business license regulations, I'm referring to a regulation that would be applicable to any licensed business in the village, whether a retailer or an office use or any other type of business entity in the village. In the zoning code, this may be amended to regulate or review as part of the special use process. And our recommendation for you this evening is that you discuss whether you will recommend to the village board regulating the hours of operation, and if so, expressly in the zoning code or as part of the special use process. Next slide, please. With regards to parking and off-street parking requirements for cannabis businesses, there are no regulations that are created under the state law, and similarly, our general business license regulations do not set forth any specific parking requirements. However, the zoning code, as you're familiar with, does create a set of regulations for off-street parking requirements based on the type of use in any particular zoning district. What we would recommend is that the Zoning Commission consider a recommendation to apply the existing zoning code regulations based on the type of cannabis business establishment in a particular zoning district, again, if they're ultimately approved. For example, we would suggest applying the retail standard of off-street parking requirements in a zoning district to dispensaries as a retail use. Next slide, please. With regards to signage, imagery, and advertising, the state law creates a number of regulations that are specific to cannabis businesses. Under state law, cannabis businesses will be prohibited from using the image of a cannabis leaf or bud depicting actual cannabis consumption by minors, promotion of overconsumption, false or misleading advertisement, claims of health, medicinal, or therapeutic claims, images that are designed or likely to appeal to children, such as cartoons or toys or animals, etc. The village's general business license code does not create any specific signage, imagery, or advertising requirements for all businesses within the village generally. However, again, as the commission is familiar, the zoning code sets forth a number of regulations for signage that discuss size of signage, signs that are allowed in a particular business, in a specific business district, the type of signs, illumination requirements, and other requirements that are specific to signage in a zoning district. So our recommendation for you this evening is that you discuss whether you will recommend any additional signage, imagery, or advertising requirements that are specific to cannabis businesses, and if so, whether those would be expressly articulated in the zoning code or addressed as part of the special use permit process. Next slide, please. With regards to building appearance, there are not regulations that are set forth in the state law that address things like type of construction materials or awnings or things like that relate to appearance. The village code generally, of course, addresses construction and life safety code from a building code perspective, but likewise does not dictate for specific types of materials and so on and so forth. The zoning code provides regulations for bulk, yard, landscaping, and buffering requirements. And again, those aren't precisely on point with building appearance. And so our recommendation is that you consider whether you would like to implement or recommend implementing, any additional building requirements related to building appearance, either expressly in the zoning code or as a special use permit. Those types of building appearance matters could be things related to windows, transparency of windows versus windows that are opaque, visibility of merchandise, things like that. Next slide, please. The state law does not set forth a specific requirement, as we understand it, for a fully enclosed loading dock. This is something that we've continued to evaluate, as it has been a bit ambiguous as guidance has developed around this law in a very short time frame. The most recent information from the Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, which is the state agency that will ultimately license cannabis businesses, is that they will require cannabis products to be delivered to restricted areas of cannabis businesses that are not accessible to customers. At one point, there was belief that there may be a requirement set forth by the state for a fully enclosed loading dock. However, we don't believe that that is the case at this point moving forward. The village's general business license code does not set forth any loading dock or specific inventory receiving processes, nor does the zoning code. Therefore, we would recommend that the zoning commission discuss whether you will recommend a requirement for a fully enclosed loading dock or whether you would recommend reviewing product delivery plans as part of the special use process. Next slide, please. Last, with facility, security, and other operational requirements, the law is quite extensive. It's about 600 pages in length, and there are a number of specific requirements that are created and additional guidance is being developed. There are a series of security and operational requirements that will be regulated by the state. The village code doesn't set forth any specific facility requirements or security requirements that are applicable to all businesses within the community, and nor does the zoning code. So our recommendation is that the zoning commission discuss whether you will recommend any specific facility, security, or operational plans or requirements in the zoning code, or whether that's something that you would recommend be reviewed as part of the special use process. Examples of facility or security or operational requirements might be things like how the building is constructed in shared wall environments. If there is a shared wall environment where a business is located, shares walls with other businesses in the same parcel, whether a cannabis business is a freestanding business, or other aspects of facility, security, and operations. The industry is is new to Illinois, and so we will see what the industry proposes in terms of best practices and facility security and operational requirements that may be in excess of the state's requirements. Next slide, please. So to sum up our process and our discussions that we anticipate will continue from this point forward. This evening, we have the hearing before the Zoning Commission to discuss potential zoning code amendments, and the commission will have its discussion. Upon conclusion of that discussion, whether that concludes this evening or whether it's continued to another meeting, is certainly up to the Zoning Commission. But once the Zoning Commission concludes its discussion, it will make a recommendation to the village board regarding amendments to the zoning code. The village board will then receive those recommendations, and they will take up the matter at a village board meeting. The timing of that will depend on when the Zoning Commission finishes its discussions. We anticipate that that would be no earlier than the November village board meeting. However, that may be later, depending on the time frame of when the Zoning Commission completes its discussions. When the village board takes up the matter, they will, as we do in any public meeting, hear public comment or invite anyone who wishes to address the board to address them. The board will first make a policy decision with respect to whether cannabis business establishments are going to be allowed or prohibited in the village of Glencoe. And if they are ultimately allowed, they will consider the zoning code amendments recommended by the Zoning Commission and consider a formal amendment to the zoning code or a set of amendments to the zoning code. We would expect that if cannabis businesses are allowed, that the board's future discussions would also relate to other aspects of the village code amendment outside of the zoning code, such as creating a business license category, incorporating the act by reference, for example, and also addressing the matter of local taxation. And with that, that concludes our presentation for this evening. I would be happy to answer any questions that the commission may have. Mr. Lee Brown is here as well, and Mr. Weiss is also able to answer questions from the commission.
I'm going to give everybody a chance. Sharon, I have a couple questions. One of them is, what is the village board at the moment isn't looking at the B1 district, which is our main business district. What's the distance between spots? It's probably on your map. The distance between spots in the B1 district and the sensitive use, which I assume is Central School.
It's 250 feet would be the closest parcels in the B1 district to the Central School.
Are there any parcels in the B1 district that are 500 feet away?
I'm going to defer to Lee.
There are. Is that near Green Bay Road? Is that where? I mean, what?
Closer to Green Bay Road, but I think that the 500-foot line is essentially village court.
Okay. And my second question is a statutory question. Pre-existing sensitive use. What's that mean? And so, for example, could suppose there is a special use permit which has been granted to a cannabis outfit someplace, and it's 600 feet away from the sensitive use. The special use permit is going to expire at the end of the lease. That's one of the things we're thinking about. Could someone who wanted to sort of game the system put a sensitive use inside there so that the next time the special use permit was up, it wouldn't qualify? Or is that not a pre-existing use?
You know, there's a whole body of law with regards to liquor licenses, and that in general, in Illinois, liquor licenses can't be issued, and this is actually in our code as well, within 100 feet of schools, parks, and nursing homes, other sensitive uses, daycare centers. And there is a body of case law about what happens. I mean, you're usually not going to establish a new park or a new school, but if a daycare center opens, for instance, within that radius, usually in that case, unless the the use has lapsed, like the dispensary has ceased operation for a certain defined period of time, you usually would not, you would consider them a non-conforming use and allow them to continue.
Other questions before, and as soon as we're done with our questions, we're going to let the public have at it. Anybody?
Stu, a couple questions. One, so what we're working on tonight in regards to a recommendation to the village board is advisory. If for some reason they grant those recommendations and create a special use that would allow the cannabis operators, would it be possible for that user to come before the board seeking variances from any of those recommendations?
So, in general, we do not allow variances from, unless we only allow variances that are permitted. So when you're looking at, with the zoning board, that there are certain variances that are permitted with regard to setback and percentages. We do not have, there are some zoning codes that are written that says that any provision of this code may be varied at the discretion of the zoning board of appeals. That is not the way the Glencoe zoning code works. If you were to set things like distance limits, that those would be hard and fast. And if those were to change, you'd need a text amendment. You would need to further amend the code to lessen those.
Okay. And then with respect to the setbacks, so presently our zoning code requires medical cannabis dispensaries to maintain a separation of at least 1,000 feet from the property line. The village is recommending a different setback.
So that actually was taken originally from the medical law when it was first passed in 2013 included a separation from sensitive uses of 1,000 feet. That has actually been taken out of the medical law now. So a municipality has the right to impose as little or as much of a distance requirement. And what they didn't want is they didn't want kind of the absurd result of that you might have recreational facilities that would be less strictly regulated than existing medical facilities. And so in the end, we recommend that however you choose to treat these or recommend treating them, that you do so in a uniform manner.
And if I may add to that, as I had mentioned in the presentation, excuse me, in the B2 district, the 500 foot distance requirement would be the distance that would allow all of the B2 district to be eligible for a cannabis business. If that is your recommendation, that all of the B2 districts should be eligible to have a cannabis business. If a greater distance was recommended, then portions of it would not be eligible.
Okay. And in the materials we were given, and some of the so nothing in the language that I read there referenced parks, but in the materials that we received, it mentioned that we could include parks.
The medical law, when it first imposed the distance requirement, it did include parks. Interestingly enough, when the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act was put in, it said that you can impose distance requirements to sensitive uses such as colleges and universities, which I think is kind of funny that they would choose those as the exemplar sensitive uses for this. But in any case, yes, you can include parks as a sensitive use.
And so in the graphs that you prepared, Ms. Tanner, are the parks represented at all in those graphs?
No, they're not. They're only the sensitive uses that are schools, daycare centers, and daycare facilities.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Anybody else have questions before public comment? And Deborah, you've been listening patiently on the phone. Do you have any questions you want to ask before we go to public questions?
No, Howard, thank you.
Thank you.
Howard, I have a quick question. I want to focus on this concept of potentially limiting the number of special use permits. If I'm looking at this right, it seems like you could never, based on the law, right? Businesses have to be 1,500 feet away from each other that are selling cannabis. So really, there wouldn't be a reason to limit, if I'm thinking about this correctly, there wouldn't be a reason to limit, or there's no reason not to limit because you can't have more than one in each district either way. I just want to kind of float this out and make sure I'm thinking about it correctly.
Yeah, you are, and that's what a number of the municipalities that we represent, when you look at one of the first hearings that our firm did with this was Lincolnwood, and they literally have 2 business districts, and they would, under even just the state law, even if they set all their local laws to 0, they could only have 2. Conversely, when you look at the city of Chicago, it's big enough that even with a 1,500-foot distance requirement, they've had to divide the city into 5 different areas and say that we're only going to allow 7 at this part, and it's just a matter of your geographical area and where your commercial districts are located.
And it's not as if you can have one cannabis retail location that goes out of business, still has its special use permit, and then another one comes in and wants to take that location or the storefront next door, then you'd be in a situation where there'd be 2. But my thought is, when you issue a special use permit, one of the conditions can be the special use permit lapses when the business ceases to exist, and then therefore it's done.
Yeah, and and we would build that in, that any special use granted would be particular to that owner or that licensee. If that licensee was transferred legally under state law, we would probably allow that if they agreed to be subject to all the conditions, but there could be no significant interruption in business. Otherwise, we'd consider it abandoned and void the special use at that point.
Anybody else on the zoning commission have a question now? Okay, so now we've come to the public comment time. We have sign-up sheets, and there were sign-up sheets for Glencoe residents. There were sign-up sheets for non-Glencoe residents. Rather than have a free-for-all, what I think I'm going to do is call on people from the sign-up sheets. If you didn't sign up, you're not prohibited from talking, but you're going to come after the people who signed up. And in order to be, it's about a little more than 2 to 1 Glencoe people to non-Glencoe people. In order to be fair, we'll do 2 Glencoes and then we'll go to somebody who's not from Glencoe.
Howard, real quick, I did leave a sign-in sheet in the back for each group, so if there are others who want to sign in, they certainly can do that.
That's fine, and if you haven't signed in and you haven't had a chance to talk, you'll get one. And then the only other thing I want to say is be succinct, be polite, tell us your name and address and where you're from. Recognize that we are not deciding whether marijuana should be legal in the state of Illinois or whether it can be sold in Glencoe. The village board is making that decision. We're only looking at how it would be regulated if that were done. And to stress that we are not making this decision, I would note that I could discuss that with you over the coffee and donuts at the train station, except for the fact that we recommended that and the village board said no. So this is not actually our call. What we're doing is we want to get comments so the village board has the benefit of that comment.
Howard, procedurally question for you. You had mentioned earlier that they could ask questions and we can respond or we can hold a response.
Yeah.
Are you advising people if they would like to ask questions, they could do that and that would cut into their 3 minutes? Or
I think if you want to ask a question, we'll make note of it, but I want to make sure, and then at the end we'll see if we can answer questions, but I want to make sure the primary reason for this hearing is to get public comment and then for us to make a recommendation which may or may not be worth the paper it's written on. So we want to hear from from you. So let me start. The first person who signed up, who also has a proxy and therefore gets 6 minutes, is, and if I get your name wrong, please tell me how to say it, Karen Sitow, 81 Lakewood Drive.
Thank you, yes. My name is Karen Sitow, and I live here in Glencoe.
Oh,
I'd like
Ms.
to-
Sitow, just for everybody, we will be keeping time tonight, and I'll give you a 30-second warning when we're approaching
And
time.
you get 6 minutes.
Right. Okay. So again, my name is Karen Sitow, and I live here in the village of Glencoe. I'd like to start off by saying I'm incredibly alarmed by seeing the extent to which you guys have already researched this and come up with loads and loads of recommendations. And as someone mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, this is the first time that you all have asked any public feedback on this topic, and I find that beyond alarming. I'd like to just take this discussion out a little bit bigger here for a second and point out, just for the benefit of everyone here, in case you don't know, that when the state of Illinois legalized marijuana, we became the 11th state to legalize it, and the first to do so via legislation versus a ballot initiative. So think about what that means. That means there was legislation that was basically forced down the throat of people who didn't agree with this decision to legalize marijuana. And with all due respect to my beloved village, it feels a little bit like that's what's about to happen again. And I will promise you that that's not going to happen, whether it's your recommendation to the board, whether we do similarly to what Wilmette has done and recommend that residents are able to vote on this decision. We'll be doing something, but this is not going to just happen here in a village meeting or with your recommendation to the board. That being said, my primary concerns about this decision, about where we would zone or if we would zone or allow people to sell marijuana in our village, can be considered on 3 points. The first is about safety, and that's safety of myself, children, and every resident of the village of Glencoe. If you make it legal for us to have dispensaries or selling any marijuana in this town, what that will literally mean, of course, by definition, is that people will come to this village to buy pot, and they will smoke their pot, and they will eat their pot, and then they'll go out and drive around on our streets, endangering all of us and endangering our children. That's unacceptable and not a good idea. I would say that I think we all understand what the motivation is, and I'm not going to waste time asking, what's the motivation to consider having these businesses in Glencoe? Money, right? Because we think we're going to get some good tax money from this. In fact, we won't get very much tax money from it, and the cost to our community in terms of, let alone what this will do to our children and to increased police responsibilities, but devastation to families. I think that probably most people here know there's a movie called It's a Wonderful Life. Does everybody remember that movie? So what happened was, we see into the future where George Bailey looks into the future, and he's leaving his lovely Bedford Falls. And we have this beautiful Bedford Falls here, that's the village of Glencoe, right? We're at a crossroads for a village right now to decide what kind of village do we want to be. Do we want to be Bedford Falls, or do we want to be Potterville? I know that my people here, and let's talk about it in terms of money. Let's talk about it in terms of property values, okay? Do we want to live in the town that is the destination town for people to come from out of town and buy their pot and buy their edibles? I don't want to live in that town, right? And I can tell you also, if you look at an article in the Pioneer Press last week, we're already starting to make enemies of our neighbors. The president of Winnetka spoke up last week and said, you know what, I don't think this is very neighborly. I don't care what zone you're talking about. You want to make where we have Binnies. I can see on the map, are we imagining that we're going to turn where the Walgreens used to be into a huge dispensary? So that'll be just like our southern central location for drugs and alcohol, and everybody should come into town and buy and use there. It's not what I envision. The president of Winnetka is saying he doesn't think that's a good idea either. Let's make a decision to be more like Bedford Falls. You know, this village is beloved because of the quintessential, lovely, beautiful, bucolic town that we live in. Let's join Winnetka, who's already red flagged this and said, let's put this on hold. I will eat my hat if Winnetka ever allows there to be a dispensary in Winnetka. I don't believe it, and based on what their village president is saying, it's not going to happen. But let's join Highland Park, Lake Forest, Lake Bluff, Glenview. Well, Met is bringing this, as I said earlier, to a resident vote. Do we want to be an island where everybody comes and says, let's go to Glencoe? That's the place where you can buy and use. That's not what this town is about, and that's not why I live here. I've lived here, raised my family here. We've lived here for 20 years, and that's not what I think is a good idea. I'll say that the second piece is let's not underestimate the message that this would send to our children. This is going to be complicated enough to raise kids when all of a sudden now marijuana is legal, right? It used to be that, and currently we can say to our kids, drugs are illegal, you can't use drugs, and now it's going to be much more, there's going to be some nuances here, right? But what I certainly don't want to do is send a
30
message to my
seconds.
children that there's pot signs all over and come to this town because this is where you can buy and use, because I'm a therapist, I'm an alcohol drug counselor. I am here to tell you, do not underestimate the message that you will be sending to your children if you say, yeah, pot's okay. Come here, smoke pot, use pot, because we can make a little bit of money off of doing it here. So it's a wonderful town. Let's keep it a wonderful town. Thank you.
Thank you, Miles Mendoza.
Hi, Miles Mendoza. I live at 756 Glencoe Drive. Is there an option for you to be able to recommend that you zone it nowhere? I mean, is that an option that you have?
That's not what we've been asked.
But is it an option that you have?
Like I said, we've not been asked that, I don't think that's what we've been asked. We've been asked how to regulate it if it's approved. And the village board will decide whether it should be approved and how it ultimately should be regulated.
So I would respectfully ask that you consider recommending nowhere. So if, from what you've told the group here, it sounds like you're opposed, you wanted to make a recommendation against the legalization, or not legalization, but whether or not Glencoe permitted it. And perhaps you go out on a limb and recommend that it gets zoned nowhere. I'm a father of 3 boys. I moved from Colorado just recently, so I understand what it does. The law may have all kinds of things that it will regulate, but the reality is when you have it in your town, you see things like wafting. People waft their smoke on other people. And the more available it is, the more you're going to see that. It's a general indication of a town's support of marijuana when you walk into that town and you find dispensaries. Go to Colorado, you'll see the difference between suburban areas, nice suburban areas, versus seedy areas. It's a lot like strip joints. Those are illegal here too. Would we want one of those in Glencoe? I don't think so. I think we know what it would do to our property value. We have addiction in my family. I would prefer to have a city and a town that I live in that doesn't recommend marijuana in our own township. That's for my kids, that's for my family. That's important, and it's about health. So I think, and I don't like the process for which this, happened. It did seem to happen under the cover of night. We don't have the disclosure around any conflicts of interest that you all might have or the board might have, whether that's working for a law firm that's representing the marijuana industry or any other conflict. It doesn't feel like there was a lot of transparency in this process. So I would just ask you to go out on a limb and make the recommendation that there is no zoning approval whatsoever, despite what you think you might have been asked.
30 seconds.
Jessica Tucker from Winnetka.
Good evening, Jessica Tucker, Locust Street in Winnetka, and I'd like to thank you for inviting your neighbors to participate in this public hearing. You know, we have been neighbors here for 150 years, and I think we do share the same values and character and integrity and discernment and caution when it's called for. And I would just urge you to have that discernment and caution before you make a recommendation to the village council. And, you know, I agree with the gentleman. You certainly have the jurisdiction and discretion to make an advisory recommendation that the public that you're hearing from, your residents, are recommending no location in this community. If that is indeed what they're saying, you really do answer to your community. And so what your community tells you is really what you need to convey to your village board so that they will be reflective and representative in their policy decisions of what this community stands for, what this community values, and what this community wants to see in their community or they don't want to see. So I would ask you to just keep that in mind. And if you do have to go down this just awful slippery slope. Oh, and I will mention I'm a former village president in Winnetka, and I will tell you, Winnetka was overwhelmingly opposed to any sort of retail cannabis. And we just introduced an opt-out ordinance on October 1st. So it will be adopted, so we'll be totally opt-out of this terrible slippery slope. But if you are going to go down that path, would you please not consider Hubbard Woods? We consider that a blended community of families and children. You have Kid Motion right there in your mall. That is a daycare. That is a drop-off center. That is kids all day long. You've got the C2 Learning Center right there. You have Sacred Heart right down the street. You've got parks. You've got so many kids and families and dogs. I just can't imagine that Glencoe would want to do this either to itself or to its neighbor. So thank you so much for your consideration.
Robert Jamal Buther.
I will pass on this one.
Okay. Stephanie Bourne. If I probably got that wrong, so. Julia Court, my neighbor.
I was trying to scribble out things so I don't repeat what anyone else said, so hopefully I took everything out.
Say your name so we're sure.
Stephanie Boren, Glencoe resident. So I understand why you feel the need to address this because of the state law going into effect. However, I don't see the need to rush the process because of that. There will be many implications for businesses, employers, and law enforcement because of the legalization. I don't think it's something we need to be on the cutting edge of. As other people have said, many municipalities around us have already opted out or have chosen to take a wait-and-see kind of moratorium approach, or do what Wilmette has done, which has decided on a referendum to let residents weigh in. In Colorado, where cannabis has been legal for 4 years, 70% of municipalities have chosen not to allow recreational sales. Many use the argument that was mentioned today that they want the tax revenue, and that's the same as having a Binny's. And I mean, of course we want to replace the tax revenue from Walgreens and Hubbard Plaza, but any business that goes in there will give Glencoe tax revenue, and the extra tax revenue that people get, think they're going to get from these businesses, is that really worth it to allow zoning in that location? I personally don't think a dispensary is the same as Binny's because you could buy alcohol down the street at Walgreens, at a grocery store, really pretty much anywhere. If neighboring towns continue not to allow sales, like others have said, the towns that do can become a hub and destination, and that can cause an uptick in traffic and crime. I wholeheartedly agree that Hubbard Plaza, because of those two kit-based businesses, is not an appropriate location. I also do feel we should respect our neighbors in this argument because we share services and reciprocal discounts with these villages. There is a petition circulating on this issue of not allowing sales. As of this evening, it had 109 signatures of residents. I did send that to the board today. The people who signed this are also concerned about the dispensary that Northbrook wants to open on the corner of Skokie and Dundee. Obviously, this board has nothing to do with it, but that facility they're proposing is 11,000 square feet with 150 parking spots. That will impact Glencoe residents as well, the traffic and crime that we're concerned with. And as far as the state regulations and the 1,000 square feet, that's not even a quarter mile. So, I mean, Woodlawn Park is right there. Others have said South School is right there. I just feel that we shouldn't ride the wave here. We could, You know, we don't have to chase tax
30
dollars. We can
seconds.
slow down, take a wait-and-see approach. If this board decides to allow sales, I hope they continue to have thoughtful discussion on locations for the reasons we mentioned. And, you know, take into account that 109 citizens that aren't here, or some that maybe are not in favor of this. So do a referendum vote or something similar. While the question of whether or not cannabis should be legal was a ballot question, the question of whether or not residents want a dispensary, which to me is a completely different question, was not included. Thank you.
Jerry Lycan, Edgebrook. Please say your name correctly and your address.
My name is Jerry Lakin. I'm 1037 Edgebrook Lane. I'm also on the State Board of Health. I work with the Poison Center, and I work at North Shore. I'm Director of Medical Toxicology there. I want to make it clear, I don't represent them or their views in this way, although I think a lot of them would agree with what I'm going to say. I'm going to be talking about the medical consequences of your action, inaction, either at the board level or whatever. There's 200 hospitals in this state of Illinois. When the pulmonary vaping stuff first came out, North Shore accounted for 15% of the 4 North Shore hospitals count there, 15% of all the vaping pulmonary infiltrate issues in the state of Illinois at the time. The largest collection that's published in the literature of agitated delirium due to cannabis in adolescents is not from County, not from Harvard, not from Stanford, but from Highland Park Hospital. We at Evanston are averaging 1 cyclic vomiting case a month due to cannabis in adolescents. And probably more than that, because I'm just seeing the worst of the worst in this sense. Poison centers nationally are getting 50,000 calls over the last 5 years due to cannabis overall. Before the cannabis legislation came out, we were averaging 1,000 to 2,000 calls a year. Now we're averaging 10,000 calls a year. The lesson of the opioid epidemic is you don't promote psychogenic drugs to vulnerable populations at unlimited doses. Government should never promote it, and that's exactly what's happening here. It's being promoted, as the first speaker said, and I know this because I'm speaking to my patients. It is absolutely being promoted by the legislature to vulnerable populations. They think it's non-toxic overall. I am here to tell you of all the toxicities that I'm being inundated with in this way. This is not alcohol. The staff gave a great presentation as far as what's in the law. Let me tell you what's not in the law. The quality control. There's nothing in the law about quality control. These kids could be smoking Roundup overall because there's no pesticide analysis of this. There's no analysis of what type of cannabis is in there. What is being propagated or what's being said is not being pursued as far as an analytical process because there is no analytical process to this. That's in the law. Even in the state of Oregon, only 3% of the cannabis is being quality controlled. And that's the most important thing overall as far as medicine goes. You go to Walgreens and get Advil, 200 milligrams of Advil, it's 200 milligrams. It's not 205. So
30 seconds.
So the last thing, I'm supposed to say is that there are medical consequences to this issue. Then we're going to be seeing a cannabis epidemic in the future, just like we saw with the opioid epidemic. Thank you very much.
Brian Burden from Winnetka. Okay. Charles Lutz from Chicago.
Thank you, but I'll pass.
Steve, I think it's Buckner from Glencoe.
I'm Steve Buckman. I live on Hazel Avenue in Glencoe. I just have a few questions, not really comments. Wilmette is having a referendum. Is that correct? Does anybody know? A lot of people have come up here with pronouncements that this is happening or that this is not happening.
I don't
Okay.
know.
Our understanding is that they are planning to do that.
Okay, so I know enough about election law that there's a primary in 2019 in March, and there's a there's a primary in March, a general election in 2020. Nobody knows here whether or not Wilmette is going to have a ballot initiative on March or in November. Okay, that's question number one. It's nice to come up here if you don't know what's going on. Second question, Northbrook, you mentioned, everybody's mentioning towns that have opted out. Who has opted in within the surrounding communities? Does anybody know? Skokie? Somebody said there's a 12,000-foot facility going up near Barnaby's. Is that correct? Does anybody know? I mean, people are...
Yeah,
Okay, well,
Northbrook is currently undergoing the same process that is going on right now, and then trailing the question of what those regulations are going to be. There is a facility that, if it is allowed, would then be requesting a special permit. If the village board decides to opt out, which they've
Where the rehab center used to be? On that
yes,
corner
in
where
the former
marathon station
RSC,
used
the
to be?
former RSC building.
Okay, so if that's the case, has public safety done any analysis in terms, last I heard, there's no barrier to entry over the Edens Expressway. Has public safety have done any analysis as to whether if there is a dispensary that is out of control, whether there be any additional public safety requirements that would be needed should Glencoe decide to add one as well? Has public safety been incorporated? Because it seems to me that if Northbrook is having this at the corner of Skokie and Dundee, it's a stone's throw from where we're at. So I'm just trying to get information. I'm not trying, a lot of people here were very emotional. I'm not being emotional. I'm just trying to say, what are the facts here? What are we dealing with? And it seems like everybody is very vehemently against this, that it's going to destroy our town, when I go to Barnaby's every Friday. It takes me 5 minutes to get there. So it's going to be in our town no matter what. I like to know what the information is, and it just seems to me there's a lot of emotion, and a
30
lot
seconds.
of chaos, but nobody really knows what's going on. And I don't know either. I'm not here to say this is the facts. I'm not here to talk about opiate epidemics or anything of the nature. So maybe more information is needed.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not reading this. You live at 246 Dennis Lane. Come on up. When you get up, say your name slowly so we get it and your address.
Vern Roseauer.
Okay.
Sorry about my penmanship.
Mine isn't any better.
I've lived here now for 45 years, and by far this is about the most controversial issue that's come before the board. And with that said, I think the health issue that's confronting our next generation is very serious. I think if you go online, you'll see a lot of information dealing with health and the consequences of smoking cannabis. I'm hoping that the amendment to this ordinance is not considered, and that what the people say here is to be considered serious, and that our future of our children is at stake. Too many issues out there are confronting them right now, and drug is one of those issues that should be forbidden. So take this into consideration as a factor for the next generation. I thank you.
Thank you. J.D. Burns from Tower Road, Winnetka.
Hello, good evening. My name is J.D. Burns, 1519 Tower Road in Winnetka. I'm the father of two children who live in Winnetka with my wife. I'm also the current school board president at Sacred Heart. I'm not here in that capacity as much as just a parent and a neighbor. My concern is specifically with the Zone B2. I think I heard the recommendation tonight that it be considered, instead of having a 1,000-foot barrier, that the board, or the committee, excuse me, take into consideration a 500 square foot, or 500 foot barrier. Did I hear that correctly? Did I?
The ordinance, the state ordinance, the state law doesn't require any barrier. And for liquor, it's 100 feet.
Mm-hmm.
And we're being asked whether to recommend any distance or none. And you know, and by the way, if this is done by a special use permit, the special use permit, as I understand it, can override all the limitations anyway, because the special use is legislation. But but absolutely, there's a question of whether 100 feet or 500 feet or 1,000 feet is right. And obviously, as someone who's president of Sacred Heart, you have an interest. So we want to hear it.
I do, thank you. And so, you know, my opinion, and for what it's worth, right, would be, it would clearly be the further of the distances. The lady here mentioned, right, there's Sacred Heart in the B2 area there in Hubbard Woods. There's the Mathnasium, there's the C2 education. So you have, you know, quite a few educational facilities that are, you know, directly impacted within the B2 zone. I also find it interesting that there's it sounds like a very strict regulation about the 1,500 feet between two dispensaries, and yet there's some notion that maybe it's flexible when we're talking about where the dispensary is located next to children. I find that kind of a odd circumstance that we would protect another business instead of where our children are located on a daily basis. So as a neighbor who lives down the street and somebody who is a resident of Winnetka, right, I'm proud of our community for not wanting to go forward with this path today in Winnetka. I hope that Glencoe takes the same approach and decides that this is not the right path for Glencoe. And then obviously very, very much specifically as it relates to the B2 area.
30 seconds.
I really hope and ask that serious consideration be given to what that minimum distance is if the board should go ahead and recommend a dispensary. My preference would be not B2, but if it has to be, at least please make it more than the 1,000 feet. Thank you.
Thank you. Back to Glencoe, John and Sandy Lyons, 476 Woodlawn. I'm going to guess you're John.
Yes. John Lyons, 476 Glencoe, resident here for 38 years. Raised 3 boys here. All of them went to Sacred Heart. You know, like somebody else that I heard earlier, okay, our family does have an abuse problem, okay? And the concern that I have about us approving dispensaries, which I always found amusing. I'm old enough to know that when I grew up, we called them something besides dispensaries. But the concern that I have is not only for the public safety, which is probably the first concern, but I think it's a concern I have about why I came to Glencoe and stayed in Glencoe in the first place. I came to Glencoe because it was a safe community. It was a great community to raise a family. Remains that way. I just don't see how approving, okay, regardless of whether or not we have 1,000-foot or 500-foot dispensaries, okay, for marijuana or cannabis in the village of Glencoe, which has less than 10,000 residents, is going to help our image, okay, as a family community. That's my greatest concern. If people want to do this, that's their business. I could care less. But in terms of the image of our village, my home for 38 years, where I raised my kids, I have a huge objection about us approving dispensaries here. That's it.
Thank you. Peter Lutz. Okay. Alex Sokol.
Hi, Alex Sokol, 270 Wentworth. I've lived in Glencoe for over 30 years now, and it's interesting that this issue is finally being raised as the law was just passed this year. I just sense a lot of hysteria over what the possible negative outcomes would be for having a dispensary. And both my parents have medical marijuana cards and conditions that they need medical marijuana for. And having them close to the home would be very convenient for them and for anyone else who wanted to responsibly use cannabis for their medical conditions or for personal enjoyment. The B2 area near where we live also has a giant Binny's, and I just find I'm not equating the two, but it will be a law to be able to consume and purchase at 21 years old. So I think we should leave that decision up to the adults, and the idea that people are going to be walking around the streets blowing smoke at other people clearly misses the point that the law would not allow public consumption, and driving under the influence of cannabis would be the same as driving under the influence of alcohol. I do think that it's important to open this up to the public and get everyone's opinion, but I do think that the hysterics around the negative aspects of marijuana are blown out of proportion a little bit, and I think we need to look at this as a long-term plan and not a gut emotional reaction. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Kevin, I think it's Campbell, but I could be wrong, and from Highland Park.
I am Kevin Campbell. I live in Highland Park. I've been a commercial property owner in the B1 district for 35 years. I'm also the presiding officer of the Glencoe Chamber of Commerce, but I am not representing the chamber tonight. I'm speaking more as property owner. On the one hand, over these many years that I've been in Glencoe, I've had the opportunity to work with the Plan Commission, the Zoning Board, the Zoning Commission, the village itself on a number of issues and topics. And I think the village has always been respectful to the needs of the business community, particularly now with the current administration we have. The zoning board liberalized and opened up additional usages for first floor spaces a few years back, where we now permit tutoring businesses and dog grooming businesses, pet grooming. And so I find it interesting that we're considering the B2 district, where we now do have some children-centric type of businesses. I have a tenant who owns a toy store in one of my buildings, and they asked me when they re-signed their lease a couple of months ago if I would consider a cannabis business for my property if I had a space available. And of course I told the village had to address this topic. And it's something you do have to address. It's been laid in your lap, and that's what we're doing here. But I told my tenant that I would not consider that. And I do realize there are tax collection opportunities here for the village, but I don't think that that's a factor that we need to really consider. There are other factors to consider. Glencoe's a very special and unique community. We're a community that other communities look towards when they're doing their downtown planning. I don't think this is appropriate for Glencoe, whether it's the B2 district or the highway frontage district. And I would prefer that we respect our neighbors in Winnetka. There are concerns there with schools, parks, etc. And I just don't see this as being a good fit for our community. And
30 seconds.
I hope that you'll take that into account, and I'm sure you will. And I will yield my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell. Ryan Cole, 422 Adams.
Hello, Ryan Cole from Adams Avenue here in Glencoe. Glencoe was just recently voted one of the best places to live. I think this can actually destroy that ranking. We just heard about Winnetka tearing this down. So my thoughts, possibly bring in people from outside our community who we don't want coming in, allow our kids to have easier access, possible increase in auto fatalities and pedestrian fatalities, increase in crime, property prices may drop. Now, this is what the experts say. This is from the Pioneer Press, which most of you probably seen. For those who haven't, here it is from June 25th. Police Chief Kyle Murphy said as the department's top priority is public safety, the new law prompts numerous concerns, including regulation, illegal trafficking, driver safety, and the potential impacts on our youth, in spite of the 21-year-old age restrictions. In Northfield, officials plan to seek guidance on how to deal with the new law from the Illinois Attorney General's office and the Cook County State's Attorney's office. Glencoe Deputy Chief Rich Weiner said while he was disheartened by how quickly the law was passed last month, public safety officials in the village have already taken classes to learn more about the impact of marijuana legalization on the community. Like many law enforcement officials, Weiner said he fears the state's legalization of marijuana will lead to an increase in impaired drivers on the roads. Weiner said police officers can become certified drug recognition experts who are trained to recognize impairment in drivers under the influence of drugs other than or in addition to alcohol. But as there's no roadside sobriety test to detect marijuana use that is similar to the breath test used by officers who suspect a driver is impaired by drinking alcohol, Weiner said enforcement remains a troubling issue. To train law enforcement to help combat the issue will have an astronomical cost, which will be prohibitive to any initiatives, Weiner said. Kids are getting the message. Well, it can't be that bad if it's legal. If they see mom and dad are smoking, they're going to think, I can do it too, Weiner said. So this is from the experts. The first part was my thoughts, but I hope you listen to the experts and consider this. Thank you.
Thank you. Dieter and Alicia Schmitz, 69 Lakewood Drive.
Thank you. Dieter Schmitz, Lakewood Drive, as you said. My wife and I have a gaggle of children, including 3 who will turn 21 in December. And we are longtime Glencoe residents and are very much opposed to bringing dispensaries into the village of Glencoe. And one of the concerns we really have is the safety of the children, safety of the community, the messages. And we would urge the zoning commission to do as the second speaker said, let's zone this right out of Glencoe. Thank you.
Mike Rosenthal, 350 Jackson, Glencoe. You signed up for Winnetka, but we know you're from
I'm
Glencoe.
sorry about that. The sign-in sheet was full. I'm Mike Rosenthal, 350 Jackson, Glencoe.
Okay.
First, thank you for the Planning Commission to be here. I know that you have other things you want to do tonight and all the other heated meetings that I've seen, but I want to say thank you for doing this. You're volunteering your time. Everyone here is volunteering their time to show up too. So I've lived in Glencoe for over 20 years. I've got 4 kids. 3 are in their high school, 1's in junior high. The main reason we stay here is it's a safe place to raise our family, and the second reason it's great schools. Anything that I've seen the village do over the years has always been in maintaining the character of the village. So just a brief history down memory lane. Maybe 50 years ago, the village was offered the land west of the Edens Expressway, which is now this frontage road property. The village at the time said that wasn't in the best interest of the village, and they didn't think about all the property tax and sales tax dollars they were going to have, and they said no. Then we fast forward about 15 years ago, 2 holes of the Glencoe golf course were offered to make a luxury hotel development that at the time was going to increase the assessed value for Glencoe by about 15%. There were a lot more people in the room for that meeting than there were tonight. They said no. There was a ballpark field that was going to be built over at West School, or at Watts Park, with a permanent home run fence. There was a baseball field that was going to be built over at Central School. Those all got shot down. And then one of the other ones that was one of my favorites was when the Public Works building was going to be sold to a mixed-use development. If you want to talk about people thinking dogs and cats were going to sleep together, that was the meeting. All those meetings, the people of Glencoe said, we want to maintain the character that we have. And the village said, we're going to listen to you, and they said no. In much due respect, my informal conversations with the village trustees have said that what this committee is going to recommend is what they're going to do. They would have a very hard time recommending passing the drug dealership in Glencoe, as I call it, if this commission says we do not want a drug dealership. I know that your purview was how are we going to regulate it, but you have the choice to say no drug dealership. We want the rug store over on Frontage Road, not the drugstore. So I strongly suggest and ask you to say no drug dealership in Glencoe. Thank you.
Tim Dreekoff, 31 Meadowview, Northfield.
Hi, thank you. It's Tim Dracoff from Northfield. I actually grew up in Glencoe on 228 Mary Street, and my folks still live there. I'm here for two reasons. First one is Sacred Heart School. Like JD, who spoke before me, I'm on the board of Sacred Heart School and have 4 children who go there. We have 25 families who live in Glencoe, a number of which are in that Woodlawn and Mary Street area east of the tracks. It would literally be walking or riding their bikes right by the Walgreens site if this was there. I think if this commission would do anything less than a 1,000-foot radius from our school or any school would be an irresponsible act of this commission. Second, just a little advice. I really hope you consider, from a zoning perspective, the volume of people that this is going to bring in. This isn't going to be another liquor license. These are going to be far more limited than a liquor license. Particularly if our neighbors in Winnetka and Northfield and other places aren't going to have these. There'll be a huge demand for this and a very limited supply. I would think more like a casino license than a liquor license. This Blaine's Casino out in near O'Hare, that's the only casino within about 25, 30 miles. An extreme example versus this, but they have 8,000 visitors per day come to that facility. Think about that. Anything like that coming to Glencoe, it's maybe more than you're bargaining for. And finally, if you do think Glencoe really does need this, it makes far more business sense, practical sense, logical sense to put it out by the car dealerships than it does to put it right in the middle of Hubbard Woods, by our school and by the other children's and other locations that are there. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Stan Nipberg, 169 Lake Street.
Good evening. Stanley Nitzberg, 169 Lake Street. Since this is the zoning commission and there'll be an opportunity to speak to the village board soon at an upcoming meeting, just thought I'd raise a few zoning commission related things, having had the pleasure to sit behind that bench a long time ago. So consider expanding what the sensitive uses are to parks and child-centric type businesses that are already here. The discussion is made in terms of distances, and many references were made to 100 feet from alcohol and binnies. In the 37 years I've lived in Glencoe, I've never seen someone sitting with a brown bag at a bench or at a school or at the sidewalk drinking out of the brown bag. The cannabis provides a different opportunity for use than alcohol does relative to the public experience and the consumer experience in our street and our village in that regard. So I don't think the comparisons and the use of alcohol and binnies is quite the same. And in a way, you have several decisions to make. Make a recommendation that it shouldn't be allowed at all in zoned. Obviously, choose between the districts that are available, or just say, let it be in Glencoe. So why are we choosing and eliminating downtown? So if you're going to go ahead and recommend it, let it be in Glencoe. And if not, use your best judgment and say that it shouldn't be near any sensitive use, the distances should be longer, and if it's not good enough for downtown, it's not good enough for the B2 district where people are living. We have schools, we have parks, we have access to public transportation, we have the trains, etc. So those are my thoughts for tonight.
Before you leave, do you mean that?
What?
Would you be okay if we said okay?
No, I'm trying to make a point about not picking specific areas within the village.
So would you be okay if we said B1, B2.
Absolutely not. I don't want to hear it all, for the public record. And can I just ask one question? I mean, the map's great. Sometimes just lines with 500, 750 is a little easier to determine, but I think we can interpret that. One question is being held at the next village board meeting in October or November? Does anybody know when it's going to be on the agenda for public opinion?
It depends on what happens tonight. And if there's a recommendation tonight, I'll let the act shop defer to the village manager.
I would expect that the soonest, if there's a disposition by this board this evening, the soonest it would be before the village board is in November.
Okay, next third Thursday.
Correct.
Okay. At probably Central School or somewhere for the crowd that's going to have to be held. Thanks. Thanks for your contribution to the village.
David Roberts, Winnetka.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity to speak. I'm a resident of Winnetka, and I appreciate you taking your neighbors' input on this issue. The one thing I would say, I want to reiterate a lot of what's been said. I don't support this in the North Shore, and I would hope that you would follow Winnetka's lead and be a good neighbor and not expose our children and families to this. A lot of us, I think we share the same values, and I'm really surprised it's come to such a discussion in Glencoe. I have small children that attend some of the child facilities in Harborwoods Plaza, so I just think that, and from a process zoning standpoint, I think it would be helpful to draw a heat map showing like the radiuses around some of those existing facilities like Kid Motion and the C2 facility and some of the parks. And I think if you did that, that map would be a lot broader and probably not really be allowed if you wanted to put it as including more sensitive use areas, because that's probably has some definition that you can define. Over by the Edens is one thing. Those people are going to buy their pot, get in the freeway, and go out of town. But I can just imagine thousands of people driving down Tower Road next to my house, and where my kids ride their bikes. And you can't. What we've known in Colorado is not that it's completely safe. I'm a physician. I deal with people who are injured in car accidents often, and there has been an increase in road traffic fatalities in the states that legalize it. There's a trade-off. You let people smoke their pot in their own house. Some of them don't, and they make more mistakes. And Tower Road is going to be where a lot of people drive in and out, and that's where I live. And I just think it's really a change that affects public safety, not just in Glencoe. And I'd like you to consider that, especially the B2 district, which is really close to where I live. So appreciate your time.
Thank you. Oh, the other person was Nicole, apparently a spouse. Okay. I think. Oh, okay.
Hi, my name is Nicole Roberts. I live at 864 Burr Avenue in Winnetka. My 3-year-old attends Kid Motion, and I'm not going to reiterate all the wonderful things that have been said by so many people here who are against the cannabis shop. I'll just say to the board members, thank you so much for all the work that you do, and don't let opening the pot shop be your legacy. I can tell you're here because you care so much about the community. You've done a beautiful job. We use your businesses all the time. I feel so fortunate to be so close to Glencoe. We live right on the border. Don't let opening the pot shop be your legacy. Thank you.
We've gone through everyone who signed up to speak. Is there anyone else who's here who wants to say anything about marijuana in Glencoe? Come on up. Tell us who you are.
My name is Nadia Kabalovic. I live at 175 Lake Street in Glencoe. I just want to touch on something related to the setbacks, and certainly did not spend nearly as much time as the staff of Glencoe doing research, but just informally did some research to look at what some other communities have looked at in terms of the setbacks and wanted to address that. So we've talked about the 500 feet in Glencoe. In Evanston, they're looking at 750 feet. I couldn't find anything related to parks or schools or what have you for Evanston specifically, but Niles has said 1,000 feet from a school and 500 feet from a park. Skokie approved 1,000 feet from a school or a park. Chicago has said 500 feet from a school or a park. And Deerfield has said 500 feet from a park or 1,000 feet from a school. So again, just similar to other folks who live in Hubbard Woods and are near that area as I am, where my home is, I fail to understand why the standard in Glencoe would be less restrictive than in some of these other areas, especially if you consider the parks that are there and the proximity to children. The other thing that has been talked about quite a bit is just the knowns. We know there will be some additional tax revenue that will come in. There are a lot of unknowns. We don't know the impact to our community. We don't know the impact to the criminal element. We don't know the impact to traffic accidents. We don't know the impact to our property values. We don't know any of those things. So we have one side of the equation, but we don't have the whole equation, which I think is very dangerous when we're looking at something like this. It is very new. I don't know why we would want to be one of the first movers. That's all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Come on up, tell us your name, where you live.
My name's Andy Bullock. I live at 444 Drexel Avenue, and thank you for recognizing me, Mr. Chairman. Some of us didn't follow correct procedure and sign the sheet, so thank you very much. Make no mistake about it, myself and my family were completely opposed to cannabis here in town and whatnot, and I know we're not here tonight to debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. So I would actually like to start out by thanking everyone here tonight for all the work you guys are doing. I know this is a tough hand to draw, and you've seen a lot of the pretty firmly held opinions from people, so thank you for your service to our village. I think we all really appreciate that. So having said that, just a few quick points about the zoning process here, as best I understand it. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm sure I'll make mistakes here, but one thing that I would say, to echo what people were saying, the 500-foot limit, as I understand it, was set because we were trying to make that on par with what the medical use was, and that's certainly a way to go about it. But I would urge the board to not link medical use with recreational use. I think that there is a large and very distinct difference between the populations that would be using in both situations like that. So I'd say please consider delinking medical from recreational use there. The second thing would be more of a procedural thing, and I understand our friends in Springfield have said that there's a 1,500-foot separation distance between dispensaries. I would ask that we consider kind of codifying that in any discussions that we would have here, because if Springfield were to change that at some point in time, you could see a clustering effect. So if we are going to consider this, I would ask that the board consider codifying that for our village. And the final point that I would make is to please consider increasing the impacted facilities to include parks as well. I think that is extremely important. We are talking about children when we're talking about schools, daycares, and facilities like that. So I think it's only logical and consistent to lump parks in with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else who has not had a chance to speak about marijuana that wants a chance? Yes,
Hello,
ma'am.
and thank you. I am a Winnetka resident.
And
So
what's your
thank
name?
you for Cecilia Milotti, 422 Rosewood. I just wanted to add something to what the gentleman who spoke, who is on the North Shore, I guess the 4 hospitals. And I know that there are a lot of edibles, and I am just wondering, some of the edibles are lollipops, and I don't know a lot of adults who really want to be using lollipops for cannabis. And I think this is more to attract children. Maybe a parent would walk into a cannabis shop and with a child and the child will see the lollipop. And I'm just wondering about the whole cannabis industry. And I really do not think that either Winnetka or Glencoe should encourage the use of cannabis, because when you use it in a edible form, you do not get the immediate. I read a lot of medical reports, and there's Dr. Sirota who has given a lecture, and I attended it. And in order to feel the effect of marijuana, when you eat something or you suck on the lollipop, you do not feel it, so you take more and more and more, and you end up having overdosed. So please, really think about it, because you will not be able to undo this. Thank you so very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Going once, up. Come on up. Tell us who you are and where you live.
Hello, I'm Vivian Nitzberg. I live at 169 Lake Street in Glencoe. I've been a resident here for 37 years. My husband Stanley also spoke. My recommendation is that you table this. I honestly believe that after hearing everyone speak today, there seems to be quite a consensus that we're moving quite quickly on this, and that there hasn't been enough public discussion or awareness of what is happening. I do believe that you have a choice, and your choice needs to be to listen to the people of the village, of the people that live near the village, and of everyone who cares about the village. I really ask you to sleep on this, not to move quickly. We don't need to be at the forefront of any of this. Thank you.
Anybody else? Go ahead. Although, you know, we in theory get a question when they're done.
Are we finished with
Wait,
Stuart, I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
Do we as a body have the authority or the power to vote not to amend the code to include dispensaries?
Yeah, yes, you can. I mean, what is the interesting thing is that this is
full disclosure. That should not telegraph which way I vote. It's just a question that I'm asking in terms of what our limits are.
Yeah, I mean, you're a recommending body, so whether you recommend one way or the other, the board is not bound by that. And so, in the end, what the board, if the board decides to go forward and you do not provide guidance, then they're going to work kind of from scratch. So that is the risk of leaving it as is. The one thing that would be noted is that if the code stays as is, that medical facilities would still be permitted because they must be permitted by state law. You have to allow them. But it is highly unlikely that a medical-only facility is going to open up at this point, because it would be a business going through significant expense to limit itself to a much smaller market. But technically, a medical facility would still, you couldn't prohibit a medical facility from locating in Glencoe.
And another quick question. Do we know of any studies that have gauged the impact on property values where medical marijuana dispensaries have already been set up?
In Illinois, there have been some very informal studies. And then the other issue is that places where full recreational has occurred, places like Colorado, California, Oregon, and Washington, very little property is depreciating right now. So it is.
They're totally different markets.
It's totally they're totally different markets in Illinois. So I think that any and the limited amount of time, there'd be a lot of statistical noise, and so I don't think that there's a consensus. And the fact that every single state has done this slightly differently makes it very hard to find any comparators.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay. So we've had a presentation by our staff. We've given a chance for the folks who came here to say their piece. I understood that what the village board was asking us to do is to recommend how it should be done, if it's to be done. They're going to make all the final choices, and that's what I would propose that we consider doing. There are a list of about 10 or 11 questions as to how we might do it, and I think we should have at it. Let me make a couple of points about the comments here, all of which are thoughtful, all of which are in good faith, even the one on the side that the audience didn't like. Let me just say two things. One, I was on the Glencoe Village Board 100 years ago, and one of the things I noticed was that every time we considered something after 6 public meetings, the public would come in, regardless of what was done, and say, "How dare you surprise me with this?" I don't blame the public for feeling that way, but I should let you know that I don't agree that anybody's been surprised. There have been a number of public meetings by the village board. People are notified to come to this. They'll be notified to come to the next. Whatever is done, it's not going to be a surprise. It's going to be, excuse me, cold. It'll be done the way it's done. With that, while I get my voice back, let's talk about each of these questions. First one is cannabis dispensary.
Do we want to go back through the through the PowerPoint?
Page 4. Pardon me. I've had a cold for a week, and it went into my voice yesterday. So nobody has to listen to me talk. Cannabis dispensary. This was just a statutory thing. The idea was to compress the definitions of cannabis dispensary, which seems like a good idea to me.
I agree. I think it's easy to move through that one.
Okay. Anybody else have a thought on that, or is that okay? Straightforward. Second question is where we should allow these special uses. Audience members here thought Greenland. I respect your point of view. I'm not saying I agree with it. I get it. For the folks who spoke for Sacred Heart and the folks in Winnetka in particular, I think there was a suggestion, and we got some letters to this effect, that it wasn't very neighborly of Glencoe to say, okay, not in our main business district, but Winnetka's okay. I don't think I come out the same way the audience would suggest, but I get the point. And I actually wonder whether that we should allow the possibility, basically putting our town where we're going, we should allow the possibility for the B1 district if it's within 500 feet. That is, if we actually think, that it's not going to be as bad as all these folks do, and we actually believe that, then we ought to put our money where our mouth is. And so I would actually recommend, I want to show to the people from Sacred Heart in Winnetka, they might not agree with Glencoe, but at least we're not operating in bad faith here. And that if we think 500 feet is okay, then it ought to be okay in our business district too. So I would suggest we recommend that. I don't expect any applause because I understand that your idea is something different. But my recommendation is that we make it possible in the B1 district to extend it's 500 feet away from, I guess it's Central School is what we're talking about.
So wasn't there also a little bit of discussion over this concept of loading and primarily loading, right? When there's deliveries of the goods that are sold at retail stores, that the B1 district didn't have the physical space or the infrastructure to allow for that. Do we have more information on that?
Yeah, so what has happened is that almost all the dispensaries that were built for medical were required to have fully enclosed loading docks. And the law never specifically required that. That was something that the state ended up on a regulatory level. And so the state is now apparently taking a more lenient view that you do not need to have a fully enclosed loading dock. That could be adopted as a local rule if you feel that was appropriate. But right now, the rule that is being enforced for new dispensaries is that all deliveries have to go in through the back door and can't go in through a front door.
So basically, we could say B1, but then B1 would be, and then if we wanted to, could add more restrictions around loading, but then that would eliminate a large portion of B1 because of the backdoor access.
There are other issues that make it difficult to put a dispensary into older buildings, mainly having to do with security camera coverage. Some communities have said it has to be in a freestanding building. There are ways to do it that but and also the build out. These have to be built out more or less like currency exchanges. They have to have fully, the restricted areas have to have full mesh on the walls, roof, and then also the sides they have vaults and then safes inside of vaults. So it's a little bit difficult to retrofit an older building for that purpose.
Can't that be done with tenant improvement dollars or investment by the business owner?
Okay, I mean, yeah.
Right.
That shouldn't be an obstacle.
So anyway, my recommendation is that if we have the courage of our convictions, and if this causes people in Glencoe to think this is a bad idea, then they'll come tell us at this meeting and others. But that we ought not to disallow the B1 district to the extent it's 500 feet or more from the school.
I mean, I tend to have a dissenting view on that. I really feel that the initial setbacks that were set by the state of 1,000 feet would be a minimum that we should consider. I also feel that the proximity to the Hubbard Woods Park should be considered in some fashion, and whether that's 500 feet, which is what we're hearing as other communities are doing, should be part of our discussion here. And to be honest, I think that if you let a business like that go into the Hubbard Woods Plaza, you're risking some migration of tenancy out of there. I mean, who would want to have their business located next to a cannabis dispensary if you're trying to attract kids and teens or whoever you're trying to draw in as customers? So, I mean, I'm almost to the point where I would say we should even be looking at the B1 or the B2, and rather the HF is probably the only viable location, in my opinion. I mean, look, Northbrook is putting theirs on our border with them. They're going to put it at Dundee, and Skokie Highway.
No, it's up for discussion. It's only up for discussion.
That's where they're going to put it. If it goes in,
It's being discussed in their village just like our village.
and if we're going to have a dispensary, then the Skokie Road location to me makes much more sense. It's much more isolated. I mean, I was really moved by a lot of the commentary today. I think that it really puts it in perspective. I will freely admit, my kids went to Sacred Heart School. You know, I live in Old Green Bay Road. We frequent that shopping center. We walk to church. I'm not adversely opposed to people who want to smoke marijuana. You know, I mean, I was a college student once. But at the same time, I think there should be some limitations, and I mean, that's my view on that point.
Okay.
Stuart, I've got a quick question. I keep going back to kind of the fundamental question of, do we need this? So the real question that keeps coming up from there is, what is, or do we have any idea what the tangible, financial, economic, social, spiritual, what is the benefit of having a dispensary in Glencoe at all?
Are you asking my legal opinion?
Yes.
That's a policy question. I mean, that is really a question. I mean, I can tell you what's in the law. I can tell you what the scope of your authority is, but you know, the question of whether it fits the character of your community, that's something that every single...
No, but even if we look at, have we done any studies as what the, potential financial benefit would be? Even something simple as that. And I haven't seen any. I mean, I'm asking, again, for information.
I saw some estimated numbers. And I believe in the packet that was sent out to us, $1 million of revenue in gross sales, I think would equate to about $40,000, which is a 3% tax on that revenue, right? So that's one number.
You would get a little bit more than double that, because you get, well, what is our normal sales tax? 1%. Okay, so you get 4%, not 3%.
Yeah, that's the 40.
It's a little more.
So I just wanted to, do you have more questions?
No,
okay.
That makes sense. I saw the little graph there.
Great. And I want to take a second to thank everybody for coming out, particularly those who have stayed. It's getting late, and it takes guts to stand up before the microphone and speak. So thank you for all of you for doing that. With that said, I can't say I'm in agreement with most everything I heard this evening. I heard a lot of hysteria. I heard a lot of what ifs. I've been to dispensaries in Colorado, in California. This is now becoming a mature industry. Illinois is late to the game, the 11th state. It might be the first state that didn't go to a vote, but it was passed by our elected officials, people that we voted into office. That doesn't mean that Glencoe needs to change the zoning code. That's what we're here to discuss. But, I can just imagine, I wasn't alive during Prohibition, but I can imagine what happened back then. And I'm sure there was a lot of hysteria. And I'm sure now, looking back, a liquor store is very common. So common that we talk about it being allowable within 100 feet of a school. I think that the comments from Sacred Heart are well heard. I think a discussion is worth having on the distance from schools and parks. I think those are great discussions. But I just don't really subscribe to this thought of if there's legal sale of cannabis, now there's a drug dealer in town and it's going to bring in a whole bunch of seedy characters blowing smoke all over the place. I just don't personally subscribe to that. It's fine if other members of the board do. It's fine if members of the public do. It's not something that I've seen or expect to see in a situation like that. So those are just some thoughts I wanted to share ahead of some additional discussion. I do think, Howard, to your point, you know, when we talk about, well, maybe putting our money where our mouth is and voting to allow in B1, I think that's one angle. I think another angle is we have a little bit of a discussion on what the appropriate distances from some of these uses are. And if it's more than 500 feet, well, then maybe that eliminates B1, maybe that eliminates B2, and it leaves HF, and maybe that's a suitable outcome. I think these are things that we can discuss as a group as we move forward.
Yeah, like Scott, I'm inclined to think about further special restrictions areas, and if that does ultimately eliminate B1 because there's no way to have it be 1,000 feet from a park or 1,000 feet from a school or 1,000 feet from another child-friendly institution, then so be that. We eliminate B1 and B2 and HF becomes the only option. I think that's sort of in a more appropriate approach than as opposed to saying let's add B1 to the mix right now, just given that, you know, the recommendation that was put on the table from the village.
Deborah, if you you know, you've been sitting patiently on the phone, if there's anything, and you're not compelled to say anything, but if there's anything you want to say, now's a chance.
Okay, I do have a question, and I did not see the visuals, but what about the area along Frontage Road where the car dealerships are? Is that, which I know Glencoe gets some tax revenue from, why is that not?
It is. That's the HF district, and that is a possible place.
Okay.
And that's the, you know, I think it's fair to say that's probably the least controversial place for the audience here. You know, whether it's, you know, better or worse, who knows, and whether it would have a decent shot of succeeding if Northbrook had a big warehouse just down the road. But yes, that's absolutely a possibility.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I personally think that if you build it, people will come, and whether it's on Frontage Road or in B1 or B2, why put it in B1 or B2 if we have another option?
Okay.
That's my opinion.
Okay. So we have, you know, I'm detecting 3 of the board members who are leaning towards restrictions that would push this towards the HF district, and Alex hasn't weighed in, and there are 2 of us that are not inclined to those restrictions. I would note, I mean, I recognize we don't know for sure what's going to happen, but the statute prohibits all public use. You have to use marijuana in your home. We're not considering having a place where people could use it in the store. So I don't think it's particularly relevant with that it's going to be close to a park, because if you're using marijuana in a park, that's illegal, just as it's illegal to use liquor in a park. And I get that it's possible that you don't have a brown paper bag, but if you're smoking something, it can be smelled. And yes, I guess it's possible that you could have, you know, candy or something. But in any event, so I'm not as alarmed by B1 and B2. I have the impression right now it's 3-2 to recommend HF.
And H would like to invite Northbrook to have a facility as a response. It'll make it more likely that Northbrook will have a large facility on the border. Just remember that when you vote.
Does that matter?
Northbrook, which is way bigger than we are, has a much bigger business district, spends exactly 0% of their time worrying about what we do. And by the way, one of the comments tonight said it was a good thing that Glencoe turned down development that we had available to us to acquire the development of the property across the expressway. In fact, for those of us old timers, which I'm one, although I was probably 2 at the time, I'm 66 now, the cosmic screw-up of Glencoe, the cosmic screw-up of every screw-up they've ever made was after the Edens Expressway was built, we gave away to Northbrook all of the area, which is now $1 bazillion worth of commercial property. And I would hope that we will never make a decision like that again. It was, I don't think this is it. I don't think there's as much money here. But that was, and they turned it down because they thought, oh, we'll have to do police and fire over there.
Clarification, I was not in favor of that land being given away. I was putting that out as a decision.
No, I know, I'm not blaming you, and I'm not holding it against the rest of your argument, but it wasn't good salesmanship for me. Because I remember when I was on the village board 30 years ago, some of the old timers came in and reminded us about how that was just a terrible, terrible thing to have done. Anyway, okay, we're get off of that. I detect 3-2, sort of leaning towards HF.
Point of clarification, I would not say 3 I mean, I don't know who's 3 and who's 2, but if you're counting
You're
me in the 3,
yes.
Then I would not say that. I was just
Oh.
simply saying we should perhaps discuss
Okay.
whether we should expand, but not, no, I'm not.
Okay.
In that 3 to 2
So
number.
we're sort of in equipoise.
Yes.
And we're punting to the village board. There's a profile of courage. Whether to have this in a business district that's closer to people, and I respect everybody's views on that. I just don't believe we're going to ruin your lives. I know you feel we are. I don't. But I take seriously the strong views, and that has to be weighed in deciding what to do. So I think we ought to recommend. Why don't we say that we were sort of equally divided, but we respect and understand the strength of the views from both residents and our neighbors, who we have to take seriously. And by the way, I'm 66 years old. I've lived 60 of those years in Glencoe and Winnetka. I went to, when I was in high school, my family lived in Winnetka. And I would be loath to do anything to disrespect Winnetka or to make the town worse. I would note, however, that when I was in high school at New Trier, marijuana was available. I dare say it is still available. And I vacation in Colorado. Aspen is a lovely town, and there's a pot store every other place. Let me just say, for my view, I am strongly in favor of the legalization of marijuana, even though I wanted to sort of control that for my children. And by the way, marijuana is available, and my children went to New Trier also. I would like that to be between me and my children, not between my children and the police. And it's, maybe we're in a wealthy enough town that we can regulate the relationship with the police, but maybe not. Okay.
So just so I think to be able to clarify where your positions are, you don't have to do a formal motion, but I think it is worthwhile as you go through each of these to do at least an informal vote to see where you are, and we can set this up in kind of sub motions.
What I've detected is on this one we're in equipoise. Alex hasn't weighed in, but
if someone hasn't weighed in, then we don't know if we're in equipoise.
My inclination on this one is to keep them all out.
We're in equipoise. Oh, I'm not sure the audience understood what you said, or maybe I didn't.
I want to make sure that we're talking about the same thing now.
So this is up to you, but there are there are a number of issues that you need.
3 districts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there are three available commercial districts.
Right. I don't like any of them.
Okay. So that's okay. So you have 6 people in attendance, 5 present, 1 telephonically. You would need to make an affirmative recommendation, you would need a consensus of 4.
We don't have 4 for anything on this one. We have 2 for consideration of all 3 districts with an understanding. I understand that it may not be worth the candle to pursue B1 and B2 because of the strength of the opposition, which we take seriously. The goal is not to make people that live in these towns unhappy. We have 2 who would, I think, want to limit it to across the tracks in HF, and we have 1 that doesn't want to allow it at all.
And then where was Member Carlson?
And Deborah, I was sort of thinking that you were HF, which is
Correct.
So
That's
John
correct.
and Deborah, HF. We are consider all 3, and Alex is nowhere, and Sarah is wavering.
I'm in, if we're going to include B2 and HF, we should include B1, but I want to wait till I get farther down on one of their
Okay.
questions to talk more about the restrictions. And
Okay,
what that means.
that's fine, as long as we're keeping track as we go through.
Okay. I think. I think in order for us to get through this, we're gonna get through it, and then if we have the strength, we'll entertain comments afterwards. But one of the suggestions that was that we table this, and I would really like not to do that, and I think we owe it to the village board to get them something, and then everybody here will have a chance to weigh in, and they're the ones actually making the decision.
But in terms of you're making that decision, I think Commissioner Kaplan raised a very good question, which is what's the benefit? Now, you may have gotten reports that have not been presented or discussed to us, but the question of the risk or rewards and the benefits have not been discussed, nor is public safety weighed in tonight. Unless it's been given to the board members, and you've had a chance to review and discuss it, but not heard any of that here tonight.
Like I said, as a matter of procedure, I think what I want to do, and what I think the village board would like us to do, is weigh in on the ways that we would do this if they're doing it. The next item is if we have a special use permit, and I think a special use permit seems like the way to go here. For one, it allows almost total flexibility, which includes the flexibility to say no if the powers that be at the time want to say no. And I guess maybe we should have a sense of whether that's the way to go. But I think that the advice from council, and it just seems like common sense, that if they're going to do this, it would be by a special use permit, which requires a whole new set of hearings, testimony. Everybody here would have a chance to have at it again, so that if the village approved going forward, you still haven't lost, because you could come in and say all this stuff and more at the special use hearing. So I think...
I agree on special use permit.
Okay. All right, anybody disagree with special use? Okay.
I agree as well.
Okay.
Okay, so there's a consensus, or there's
Yes.
at least 4 votes that instead of it being permitted wherever it would be considered an allowable use, that it would require a special use to open and operate.
Yeah.
Now, when we talk about special use, if we have a designated area where it is permitted, can someone come in for special use out of that area? Or
No.
it has to be just
Have to be in
so
that-
even,
well-
so even the special use concept is limited just to that area? Is that
Yes.
Okay, so the answer is, I'm putting on
I
my
see
lawyer
a- I
hat.
see a butt here.
I'm putting on my lawyer hat. And I know this just because I'm litigating a wind farm case. A special use permit is considered legislation. It's not like what we do with the zoning variances, which is sort of an adjudication. It's legislation. So technically, the village they could give a special use permit and put it wherever they want, because it's the same people who pass the ordinance. But typically, when they go through all the trouble of saying where it should go, they'll have the special use in one of those places, and litigation against it would be more likely to succeed if it were placed someplace other than where they said they were going to put it.
And our code, and Glencoe's code specifically prohibits that.
Right.
So there are places where that is more of an open question. Our code would not allow that to occur.
Right. And then with respect to the number of special use permits, is that part of this?
It will be.
Part of this question?
Yeah, it's going to be, but no, let's do them one at a time. So the special use, we'll put that as something we're doing. Then we're getting, and this is on page 5, the second full paragraph, the duration of the special use permit. And the idea here, which seems, this is a staff recommendation, seems right, is we would want the special use permit to exist only as long as the lease of the holder of the permit, which would give the village control as to who's got the license. Not the license, who's got the...
The only thing I would clarify there, that lease term would include any possible extension options.
I think, I guess, that they could certainly write it that way. The goal here is just to control, so the village knows who's going to be in the space.
And so the applicant knows how long they can operate there.
Yeah.
I'm in favor of that term.
Anybody have a problem with that?
No.
Okay, so that's, Alex, you're okay with that?
I'm okay with that. I've got some reservations about a landowner and a tenant being in cahoots and signing a lease for 50 years with a 50-year options.
But the only thing there is there'd be a condition to the special use permit, presumably, that would say it only remains in effect should the business be open and operating and in good standing. And if it meets all the other conditions of the special use
if they
permit.
did something bad, they could lose their license from the state, or they could.
Yeah,
if
I understand.
If they sold to minors, or okay. Still on page 5, towards the bottom of the page, there's the 500 feet. So the staff recommends 500 feet. 500 feet would exclude some of the B1 district. There are, we've been talking about that. So there, I think John wants it to be 1,000 feet.
That's correct.
I think Alex and I are probably okay with 500 feet.
Scott.
Spaced out. Sorry about that.
I was going to say, are you sure about that?
No. Alex wants it in Greenland. Deborah, are you 1,000 feet?
I'm 1,000 feet.
Okay.
And this is only for the B2 district.
This
right.
Well,
Will it be for any of districts?
It's really, this is,
Well, there's a second recommendation.
Right. HF is different.
yeah.
But we theoretically could do for all districts if we wanted to.
I would
So, I guess.
Or we could stick with their recommendation.
Which we could, because no one's worried about the HF district.
Correct.
Exactly.
Except for Alex.
Right.
You don't want an HF either.
I wouldn't want an HF either, but if
Okay.
if it passes that it is going to be put in HF.
All right,
then-
so we're okay with the staff's recommendations at the bottom of page 5 and over to page 6.
Except for
What was the consensus?
I'm not.
There's a, except on B2, John wants 1,000, Deborah wants 1,000, Scott and I are okay with 500.
There'll be no agreement on the B2 one.
What do you like?
And
It doesn't matter.
Sarah's in equipoise.
It doesn't matter. Yeah. I mean,
You might have.
if I have to make a choice, I can, but it technically doesn't matter right now.
Nothing we do matters. Remember the coffee in the railroad station. Okay.
Whether it includes
So,
all these components or
you
not.
guys got where we are so far? Okay.
I don't think that we actually, we understand that if the consensus will be to allow it in the HF district, that there would not be a distance limit, or a separation or distance limit in the HF district.
Correct.
If it were to be allowed in in either the B1 or B2 district, there is not a consensus on what there's not 4 votes for 500.
Right.
There is not 4 votes for 1,000.
Right.
Well, actually, Alex, because I know you say no, none at all, but if
You vote
the
for
village
1,000.
was to say, we're going to go with B1, B2, and HF, what would be...
In that context,
would you,
it'd be
in
a
that, what
1,000.
would you be your...
It'd be a
would
1,000.
So then that does leave us to a place where we could potentially...
Assuming that they voted for the B2 district.
But that means you couldn't be in either of those places, right?
Right.
And that is practically a way to get to where what your consensus is.
Get a B1 by seeing 1,000.
Yeah. I mean, if you feel that the 1,000-foot distance requirement is what is appropriate and it eliminates one of the B districts, then you have effectively decided it's not appropriate in that district. And that is a very rational way of going about doing that.
1, 2, Deborah's 3, Sarah, and Scott and I are not there, so to you.
Practically, given, Howard, to your point around the law, I think 500 or 1,000 doesn't make a significant difference. I understand where the audience is coming from with concerns about B2 being close to areas where children are walking by, children are in that shopping center. I do also recognize that there's a Binny's in that shopping center, and in my mind, practically, they're not significantly different, so I have to lean toward the 500 feet rule.
Okay, so we're 3-3. And I would, by the way, for what it's worth, I think the police have been periodically camped out at the liquor stores to make sure people aren't buying the right stuff. I assume the police, to some extent, will be camped out. And the one place where you won't want to immediately consume what you bought is right near the store.
I completely agree with that, and I'll also just add what's the best terminology here? The threshold with which you need to show identification and that you're of age to purchase at a dispensary is extremely high, significantly higher than it is at liquor stores. I'm not going to speak for Binny's, right? I've been of age for a very long time, longer than that's been there. But this notion that kids will be available to walk in or consume outside of the store, I just want to say that this is an industry that's highly, highly regulated, way more so regulated than the liquor industry.
All right, well, this is what I would like to add. You know, I have two grown kids that live in Colorado who lived there and voted to make it legal in Colorado. And there are plenty of high school kids who have fake IDs who go into liquor stores and they go into bars, and you can be sure that the same thing is going to happen with cannabis. And so why put it in the middle of a town where kids walk by every day? You know, just put it a little bit out of sight so that they don't have to see their friends' parents walking into the store.
What's the motivation? Why do we have to have it in our town of 8,000 people?
So we are...
$2,000?
So we are 3-3.
Yeah, we're not even, there's no decision, so.
So, well, you know, so we should tell the village board that we are 3-3.
There would be no recommendation. There was no consensus on an appropriate distance requirement, except that there be a distance requirement.
But we, you know, I think you should tell them where we are. You know?
Well, I think we all are in
there's
agreement on
definitely
HF.
we're all in agreement on HF, and we're all in agreement that it needs to be 500 feet or more.
Okay, that's, I mean,
Well-
we can talk about how to craft this motion, this recommendation.
Okay.
Near the end, as you go for it.
The next item, this is on page 6, hours of operation. Yeah, I don't think we should do anything.
I agree.
Hours of operation, it's already regulated by the zoning code. There's no theory under which special hours of operation makes sense as far as I can tell. Anybody disagree with that?
No.
That can also be imposed during a special use.
Yeah, all of this stuff would be used.
I was going to say parking requirements, signage, building appearance requirements.
Right, I would say no change on any of those. So that would take us, so no change on parking, signage, building appearance. That takes us to the loading dock. And again, I would suggest no change. If anyone, I think no change, period. But if anyone wants to deal with this, that it could be dealt with during the special use process.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Anybody?
I agree, particularly given that during the special use process, we will see plans, we will see proposals, and then we can make that decision. We or whoever sits here after us.
Yeah.
I agree.
Security considerations, again, I wouldn't do anything until the special use process.
I agree.
Agreed.
Okay.
Agreed.
I think we have covered everything. Have I missed any?
I think to simplify, I think that we're going along with staff recommendation on everything except for the allowable districts. As it pertains specifically to the distance from what the uses.
Both. I think it's the districts and the distances, yeah.
So I think the motion.
Well, not only that, not to interrupt, not only that, I think we're forgetting the, fundamental premise as to whether we should have it at all.
That was not a staff recommendation. That was the village board's initial.
That's their decision.
Right.
Mr. Chairman? For clarity, could you consider whether or not you are adding or not adding the park as a sensitive site?
Okay. Anyone want to talk about adding parks to sensitive areas? And what does that mean if we did it? Does that, all this
It may mean nothing based on the distances that you're picking or not picking.
Well, it's just, if we said the two distances we're talking about are 500 feet and 1,000. If we had 1,000, I think that's probably going to rule out B1 and B2 anyway.
I think in the case of B1, the park comes into question from the east rather than the west, and any distance is going to exclude the remainder of that area.
Okay. And B2.
You got Hubbard Woods Park and you have Woodlawn Park.
But I think within 500.
500 is still, okay.
Yeah. So.
I'd make a motion to include parks in the sensitive area.
Okay. Well, let's take account. Parks.
I support parks.
I'm fine with parks.
I would exclude I would not add parks.
I'll include the parks.
With
the 500 feet.
Okay. Well, so.
I would include parks also.
Okay. So there's a.
I'd include parks with 1,000 feet.
No, parks was 500.
Parks is 500?
That's what I suggested
I thought the
earlier.
sensitive areas we were discussing was going to be 1,000.
I guess people don't think it's that sensitive.
Well, I think we have a disagreement on distance to sensitive areas, right?
We do.
And then there's a question about whether parks are as sensitive as schools.
So is that separate?
John's fine with parks within 500. You're fine with parks
500
within
feet for
500
parks.
And schools would be 1,000.
1,000 parks, 500.
Yeah.
I think it's one and the same. I do 1,000 each.
And I'm the same except at 500 each. And I think Sarah is there too.
Yes.
And so is
Deborah's 1,000.
No, I think
1,000.
are you 1,000 or 500?
I'm 1,000.
Okay.
I can count votes. 1,000. So that's 2 for 1,000, 2 500, 3 500. I'm certainly 500 in general, and I wouldn't include parks, period.
But we have one that's, where you split 1,000 for schools, 5,500 for parks?
Correct.
So you don't have 4.
No, we don't have 4.
We didn't come to.
Okay.
But we want to include parks.
Okay, so
Five
I
of
think there's a consensus to include parks and sensitive uses regardless, and there's going to probably be we're going to have to reflect in the minutes that there is a diversity of views on what the appropriate distance requirements are, and that will also obviously impact which districts this would be allowed in.
Okay. I think we've covered all the issues that were put to us. I know we haven't made people in the audience happy, but we're doing the best we can. Anybody on the board want to say something? But otherwise, I want to give the audience a chance to have at us one more time. And the fella who said he wanted to have at us, we timed him out, which
So
I didn't intend to do.
Do you want to formally reopen the public hearing portion of this?
I guess what I want to do is I want to allow, can we set a time limit? People are here, they've waited,
Yeah, you can check how many people would want to speak. I would impose the same time limit per speaker that you did previously.
Okay.
I would not limit if anyone here, if you're going to allow one person to speak, let all the people speak,
All right,
but hold them
look,
to the same time limit.
Up to you. We could shut it down now. We've done what we said we were going to do, but there are people here
I
who may
think-
want to have their say.
And so
Again,
we've gone through the process.
We have.
We've
We could declare
made our
victory.
recommendations. The next step for this is, regardless of what else gets said, is going to be to take it up with the village, who really makes the decision about whether or not there will be cannabis stores in this town and where they are.
Yeah, I think John's right, and that has to be reinforced. We just make recommendations. That's it.
Okay. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Well, no, you need to make a motion with a recommendation.
Oh, okay. Is there a motion to make the recommendations we have just discussed? Is there a
Well,
second? No, we have to.
Yeah, I think we need to state with that motion.
Do we have to say exactly what we just
No,
said?
just you can
just-
incorporate.
Yes, for staff's benefit.
Okay.
And there were, would you like to, Okay. Would you like me to take a crack at stating what I understand the consensus?
Go
And
for
someone
it.
can make, okay.
Go for it.
All right. So there is a motion to recommend the staff recommendations with the following modifications. That it, subject to distance requirements, that it would be included in the B1 and B2 district, subject to distance requirements, which may preclude that, but as well as the HF district. As a special use, which would require individual applicants to come back into the public hearing process. There would be no on-premises consumption of cannabis permitted. There would be a single unitary definition of cannabis dispensary between medical and recreational. There would be, as to distance requirements, no less than 500 feet from sensitive uses, which shall include the ones included in the staff report and include public parks. There is no recommendation on hours of operation, which would be handled on a case-by-case basis. Parking requirements would either comply with normal commercial parking requirements or handled via special use. And I think that's all that you discussed. Did I miss anything?
There was no consensus about the district.
So that was going to be my.
Well, that's, yeah, I'm waiting for them to.
I think my clarification is we didn't come to any consensus on B1, B2, or HF because there was no.
Okay, so there is
I think we did, and I'll try to summarize it here. Okay, so with HF, I think we all agreed there are no limitations on location. Is there anybody who disagrees? Okay, with the exception of Commissioner Kaplan.
The first item on the list was B2, HF. Howard then brought in B1.
Right.
We didn't come to consensus on that because there was Alex doesn't want any of those.
Right.
John and Deborah want HF only, and we were in the sort of like B1, B2, HF. So there was no conclusion on that one.
But I do think it might just be two categories, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because we have the HF, we can kind of push that aside, right? Commissioner Kaplan is voting against allowing it there. The rest of the commissioners are voting to allow it, right?
Correct.
Then when it comes to B1 and B2, there's a disagreement of the distance to sensitive uses. And so there's three of us, I think, Sarah, if you're included with Howard and me, who agree that 500 feet is a suitable distance for both B1 and B2 to sensitive uses, including parks.
Yeah.
John and Deborah are 1,000 feet.
Correct.
Except John has a little bit of an asterisk there because 500 feet from parks. But 1,000 feet from other sensitive uses, which effectively rules out B1 and B2.
And Alex, if the board decides to say yes to this, wants 1,000 across the board with B1 and B2.
Correct.
Yes, Alex. Yes. So, I think the motion is. I motion to agree with all of the staff's recommendations, with the exception of the separation and distance requirements for B1 and B2.
See, staff did not recommend B1. Staff only recommended B2 with a 500-foot buffer.
That's why.
That's
you
right.
gotta say the exception.
So you can't recommend anything regarding B1. That was Howard's introduction to the modification of the motion.
That's true, but as Howard just said, it's an exception to what they were recommending. So we agree with what they've recommended. However, when it comes to B1 and B2, we are disagreeing.
I don't think you can say we agreed with B2 at all, because I am not at all interested in B2. Alex is not interested
in B1.
In
B1.
Right.
Oh, I see. So
right. I think John and Deborah don't want
got
to
it.
B1.
I was trying to simplify it by saying 1,000 feet because that excludes B1. But if it could be a different motion, which would be that we can vote on whether or not. Why don't we just motion to have cannabis sale be allowable in the three separate districts and take 3 votes on that, and then we can go on to separation requirements after that.
So you would basically bifurcate or trifurcate the motion, that's what you have votes to include HF without distance requirements in your main motion, and you can return with subsequent motions on B1 and B2. So we could keep rolling.
So there are 3 votes for B1 with 500 feet. There are 3 votes against that. There are, how many votes do we have for B2 with 500 feet? I think 3 again. So really the situation for B1 and B2 is the same. They each get 3 votes for 500 feet. And they get 3 votes for 1,000.
Yeah, I mean, what I would emphasize is that since you're not making any final approval here, you don't really have to worry about like horse trading. Like,
Yeah,
well,
right.
we can say that there is a consensus for a motion on HF. There are 4 votes for that. There was not a consensus, and we can reflect either in the minutes or in the recitals that the zoning commission could not come to a consensus on whether to allow it in B1 or B2, and that was intrinsically tied to the impact that the distance from sensitive uses had on those on that zoning.
I think that's fair.
Okay,
That works.
Okay.
Please go.
Okay.
so moved.
Scott, okay. Is there a second? Oh, well, you know. So what is I actually think the village board can figure this out. I take the point, but I don't actually know. And I think they'd rather get it. So I'll just throw out the comment that was just made, which is there are 6 of us here. There's supposed to be 7. Might break the tie one way or the other. So one thing we should think about is, do we want to wait a month and see if the tie gets broken? I would recommend not doing that. I don't know that the same cast of characters will be here next month. I don't think the village board is interested in us delaying this. I think
They're going to make their own decisions.
they're going to make the decision anyway.
Let's
So I
press
think
forward.
we should go forward, but I don't know where Dave would be.
I agree with that.
Okay.
I agree.
And I don't know what-
Postpone?
No.
Okay, I don't think so. So, there's a motion, there's a second.
Second.
Roll call.
Do we know what we're voting on here?
Can we repeat what the motion is?
Oh my God.
A restatement of the motion would be appropriate.
You read back the motion.
Oh, you're pointing to me. Okay.
I can do it. I can do it.
Please do.
So the first motion, spoken less eloquently than Stuart, is to agree with staff's recommendations as it pertains to the to the sections that are not separation and distance requirements, right? So I'm trying to knock as much out as I can on this first motion, because Alex, even you, like, if it does pass, you'd like to see the special use provision, the parking requirements kicked to the special use,
That's
all
correct.
that stuff,
The
right?
presumption is that if we pass this.
Right. So the motion is that, to follow staff's recommendation on all of that, and follow staff's recommendation on the HF district to allow cannabis sale in that district without a requirement on a separation distance.
Correct.
Do we have a second?
And we're talking about without a requirement for separation in HF.
In HF, right? That's what staff recommended? Yeah.
Right, I thought I.
And you can vote against this.
Okay, so that's the motion.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
There's a second.
Second.
Okay, roll call vote.
Oh, but
The B2.
I understand what Alex is saying.
Yeah.
The problem is because he's voting against the other.
Yeah, that's what I was, yeah.
Yeah. So maybe we have to separate it out.
Well, I mean, you have four votes.
For it to pass.
Yeah, and
Alex can vote against
yeah,
it.
and Alex can vote against this because it reflects, you can reflect your position that notwithstanding, the condition of whether the board wants it or not, you don't feel it's appropriate in that, and that's, you can vote that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's not like a tiebreaker.
Roll call.
Howard Rowan,
Aye.
Deborah Carlson,
Yes.
Sarah L. Saucer,
Yes.
Alex Kaplan,
No.
John Satter,
Yes.
Scott Novak.
Yes.
Okay, that motion carries. Motion 2, the complicated one.
We
So this is where you wanted to actually attempt to find a, I mean,
I thought we didn't have to, based on what we just said.
okay, so, yes, you should, even if the motion fails, then that will be your recommendation that you could not come to a consensus, but a vote would be appropriate.
What is this motion again?
Okay, here it comes. I move to follow staff's recommendation on having cannabis business be allowable in the B2 zoning district, which includes a separation of at least 500 feet from separation requirement distance from sensitive uses.
Including parks.
Including parks.
Which was part of the previous motion.
Including parks.
Is there a second?
Second.
Roll call.
Howard Rowan,
Aye.
Deborah Carlson,
No.
Sarah Elsasser,
Yes.
Alex Kaplan,
No.
John Satter,
No.
Scott Novak.
Yes.
That's 3-3.
Yeah. Motion fails.
Okay. Is it even worth doing the B1?
Yeah, please do it, so it's on the record.
Okay. Is there going to be a second for that even? But we'll make the motion.
I move for the same motion on B1 as I did for B2.
Is there a second?
Second.
Roll call.
Howard Rowan,
Aye.
Deborah Carlson,
No.
Sarah Elsasser,
Yes.
Alex Kaplan,
No.
John Satter,
No.
Scott Novak.
Yes.
Fails 3-3.
And for lack of another motion, this will reflect the proceedings of the zoning commission on this docket.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Hold on, are we adopting all the other recommendations?
That already happened.
We did that
That was the first
That was the
That's the
first
one you
thing.
said,
That's
no,
when you
because
agreed.
we included HF in that.
Got it.
Is there a motion to adjourn?
Yeah, motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For people who wanted their house built.
Plan commission.